Hello guys, welcome to Eldritch Potter. Today we have an incredible story for you. Goblin War Chief found baby Harry starving at age 1 and forbidden blood test revealed Dumbledore feeding on his magic. If you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Let's get into it. Chapter 1, The Finding the Frost came early to Surrey that year. It crept in off the Thames sometime around midnight on the 1st of November, coating the neat suburban hedgerows of Little Whinging in a thin silver skin that caught no light because there was no light. The streets were dead quiet, the houses sealed against the cold, curtains drawn against a world that had spent the last 24 hours quietly, inexplicably celebrating something that most of its inhabitants couldn't name and wouldn't remember by morning. Griphook had been walking for 40 minutes. This was not something war chiefs of Clan Ironmaw typically did. They did not walk suburban streets in the small hours of a Monday morning, boots clicking on frost-hardened pavement, a travel cloak spelled for warmth and concealment draped over shoulders that were broader than a human might expect from a creature standing 4'3". They did not peer at identical houses with the particular expression of someone doing arithmetic in their head, the kind of arithmetic that doesn't involve numbers, but consequences. But Griphook had received word through the clan's network of informants, a network older and considerably more reliable than anything the Ministry of Magic had ever built, that something had happened in the wizarding world the night before. Something large. The Dark Lord who had terrorized the British wizarding population for a decade had apparently been destroyed, or scattered, or stopped, the reports varied wildly depending on who was talking, by a 1-year-old child in Godric's Hollow. The child had survived. The child was, according to the same network, now somewhere in Surrey. Griphook didn't particularly care about the politics of human Dark Lords. Goblins had survived 17 of them in the last 4 centuries, and the pattern was always the same: they rose, they burned, they fell, and the goblins kept the gold and waited for the next one. What Griphook cared about, the reason he had pulled on his boots at 11:30 and walked out of the London office of Gringotts into the cold November dark, was a single line in the report that his informant, a half-blood who worked as a ministry records clerk and had the self-preservation instincts of someone who had survived 3 audits, had flagged in red ink. Potter Child's magical signature showing significant depletion. Pattern inconsistent with combat exposure. Pattern consistent with sustained extraction. Extraction. Griphook had read that word and sat very still for a long moment, the way a predator sits still, not from fear, but from the sudden, absolute focus of something that has just spotted prey. He knew what extraction looked like. The Ironmaw clan's treasury held 3 documented cases in its restricted archives, cases going back centuries, cases that had been sealed and classified by successive ministries of magic because they were, in the language of bureaucratic concealment, inconvenient. A powerful magical child, their core quietly tapped, their excess, the wild, volcanic overflow of magic that young children couldn't control and didn't know they had, siphoned away by someone with the knowledge and the lack of conscience to do it. The child never knew. They grew up thinking they were ordinary. Average. Not quite special enough for the things they'd half dreamed of being. And someone else grew quietly, terribly stronger. So Griphook had walked into the cold November night with his travel cloak and his long-bladed goblin knife in its sheath at his hip and a small leather case containing instruments that no ministry official would have been pleased to see, and he had followed the traces, magical traces, the kind his people had been reading for 2,000 years, to a street called Privet Drive. He found the child at number 4. He almost missed him. The bundle was tucked so far under the front steps that if Griphook had been standing at human height he would never have seen it, just a dark shape against darker shadow, half buried under a browning hydrangea bush that had given up on the season weeks ago. But Griphook was not standing at human height, and his eyes in darkness were considerably sharper than any human's, and he crouched automatically when he felt it, the magical signature, thin and stuttering, like a heartbeat heard through several walls. He moved the hydrangea aside with one hand. The child looked up at him with enormous green eyes. He was perhaps the smallest 1-year-old Griphook had ever seen, and goblins, who began life roughly the size of a large apple and took 3 years to reach the height of a human toddler, had a fairly comprehensive frame of reference for small. The boy was wrapped in what appeared to be a knitted blanket over a sleep suit that had been charming once and was now stained and damp. A letter was tucked under the edge of the blanket, already curling in the damp cold. There were scratches on the child's hands, from the hydrangea, from being shoved into this corner without care, and a lightning bolt cut on his forehead, sealed and scarred over already, the wound older than a day. His lips were bluish at the edges. His magic, Grip Hook could feel it, the way his people felt all magic, through the skin of his palms, was barely a flicker. The child did not cry. He looked at Grip Hook with those green eyes and made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a question and reached out one small scratched hand. Grip Hook stood very still. He was 31 years old, which in Goblin terms made him not quite young and not quite anything else, old enough to have fought in 2 territorial disputes and earned his war chief's braid through methods the Ironmaw clan's historians recorded without editorial comment, young enough that the older council members still occasionally made remarks about his age when they thought he couldn't hear them. He had not, in the course of his life, given particular thought to human children. They were loud, they were magically incautious, and they grew up to be the kind of people who stood on the wrong side of a Gringotts counter and asked why in tones that suggested they expected a satisfying answer. He picked the child up. This was not a decision. It happened the way breathing happened. The small body was cold and the night was colder and the hand was reaching and Grip Hook's arms moved before the rest of him caught up. The child was appallingly light. He smelled of cold air and sour milk and something underneath both of those things that was the smell of magic running dry, a smell Grip Hook associated with old vaults that hadn't been opened in a century, dusty and hollow and faintly desperate. He stood there on the dark street with a 1-year-old wizarding child held against his chest and thought, with considerable irritation, that this was going to complicate his week enormously. Then he opened his leather case. The instruments inside were old, older than Gringotts, older than the current iteration of the Ministry of Magic, older than most of the agreements between goblin kind and wizard kind that everyone pretended were the natural order of things. They had been his grandmother's, who had been a blood reader, a goblin whose particular gift lay in the reading of magical inheritance and lineage through the physical blood itself, a practice the ministry had attempted to outlaw in 1754 and managed to drive underground in 1801 and had never actually managed to stop. The instruments were small and made of a dark metal that wasn't iron and wasn't silver and didn't have a name in English, and they responded to touch the way a compass responds to north, with immediate, unambiguous certainty. The sanguine reveal was not a spell in the wizarding sense. It didn't require a wand or an incantation. It required blood, a drop, freely given or taken from an unconscious subject with intent to reveal rather than harm, the distinction enforced by the instruments themselves, an intention and a specific arrangement of 4 of the 7 primary instruments in a pattern that Grip Hook's grandmother had burned into his memory when he was 6 years old, sitting in her vault room while she told him in a voice like grinding stone that the most important thing a goblin could know was the truth. He pricked his own finger. He placed 1 drop of his blood on the flat disc of the primary instrument. He drew the smallest possible amount from the child's heel. The boy flinched but didn't cry, just looked at the instrument with the same focused expression he'd been giving everything since Grip Hook picked him up, like he was cataloging it, and placed that drop alongside his own. He arranged the other 3 instruments. He waited. The reading took about 40 seconds. Grip Hook had done this perhaps 200 times over the course of his career, mostly in the formal setting of Gringotts inheritance chambers, occasionally in less formal settings when the situation required speed over ceremony. The instruments were never ambiguous. They could be difficult to interpret, the sanguine reveal gave raw truth, not comfortable narrative, but they were never wrong, and they never hid things to protect feelings. The results came in pulses of light from the central disk, casting strange moving shadows against the frost-covered pavement, gold for lineage, silver for magical inheritance, green for living connections, red for anything that was being done to the subject rather than by them. There was quite a lot of red. Grip Hook studied the reading for a long time. Long enough that the child fell asleep against his shoulder, 1 small fist curled in the fabric of his travel cloak. Long enough that the frost deepened around his boots and the street stayed silent and something in Grip Hook's chest, which he would later, privately, describe to himself as his sense of professional outrage, because war chiefs of Clan Ironmaw did not have feelings that qualified as anything more significant than that, went very cold and then very still and then very focused. The siphon was there. It was extraordinarily fine work. If he hadn't been looking for it specifically, if his informant's note hadn't put the word extraction in red ink in his mind before he'd ever touched an instrument, he might have read it as a natural magical connection, the kind that sometimes formed between a very powerful child and a trusted magical guardian. It was calibrated to look like that. It was calibrated to take only the excess, the overflow, the magic that a 1-year-old couldn't process or use. It was calibrated, in short, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had done it carefully enough that no standard ministry diagnostic would ever flag it. But the instruments were older than the ministry, and they didn't care about calibration. They reported what was there. The siphon ran from the child's magical core, guttered, half-empty, far smaller than it should have been for a child whose lineage reading was casting gold light in every direction, Potter and Black and Peveril and something older than any of those names, to a point that the instruments located with crystalline precision as approximately 14 miles northwest. The directionality was unusual. Siphons were typically passive, drawing magic as it was generated. This one had a return address. Griphook recognized the secondary magical signature threaded through it the way you recognized a smell, not from having smelled it directly, but from having read enough about it that when you encountered it you knew it immediately, the way a historian knows a signature from a document they've studied for years. Albus Dumbledore. He stood on Privet Drive in the dark and the cold with a sleeping child against his shoulder and the sanguine reveal instruments laid out on the frost-covered ground, and he felt the word form in his mind with the particular weight that only truth could produce. Albus Dumbledore. Headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards. Chief Warlock of the Wisengamot. Vanquisher of Gellert Grindelwald. The most trusted, most beloved, most universally respected wizard of the age. Had been eating this child's magic. For how long? The instruments could tell him the current state of the siphon, could tell him the signature, could tell him the direction. They could not, without a deeper reading done in a proper vault room with the full set of instruments and several hours, tell him exactly when it had begun. But the child was 1 year old, and the depletion in his core was not the work of a single night. The hollowness went too deep, had too much of the quality of something chronic, something habitual. He had been doing this for months. Possibly from birth. Griphook packed his instruments with careful hands. His face was completely expressionless, which was how you knew, if you knew him, that he was feeling something very large. He picked up the letter that had been tucked under the blanket, read it in about 45 seconds, the handwriting cramped and confident, the tone of someone who was accustomed to his instructions being followed without question, explaining in 3 paragraphs how a woman named Petunia Desley was Harry's only remaining family and how the blood wards on the house would protect him and how this was all for the best. He folded it precisely in half. He tucked it into the inner pocket of his travel cloak, against his chest. Then he looked at the house. Number 4, Privet Drive was dark and sealed and the family inside, he could read their signatures easily enough, 2 large adult magicless humans and 1 small magicless child, had not stirred. They had not woken to check on the infant left on their doorstep. It was 2 degrees Celsius. The child had been here for, his instrument suggested the letter had been deposited roughly 7 hours ago, which meant the child had been under those steps since shortly after midnight. 7 hours. In 2 degrees. Under a dead hydrangea. Unfed. Griphook looked at the house for a long moment with his flat, dark goblin eyes. Then he turned and walked away, carrying the child. He had 2 miles to walk to the nearest Gringotts emergency transference point, a permanent portkey anchor embedded in the pavement of a parking structure in Staines, paid for through a holding company that the ministry had never bothered to investigate because investigating it would have required admitting they knew it existed. The child slept through the entire walk. He was warmer now, the spell on Griphook's cloak was sharing itself with the small body held against it, and the thin, stuttering quality of his magic had steadied marginally, the way a candle steadies when you move it out of the wind. At the portkey anchor, Griphook stopped. He stood with his hand on the activation point, a specific pressure applied to a specific cracked bit of concrete, and thought about what he was doing with the clarity that had made him a war chief at 26 and would, he suspected, either make him a great deal more than that or get him killed, depending on how the next several weeks unfolded. He was taking a human wizarding child out of the jurisdiction of the British Ministry of Magic without their knowledge or consent. He was doing this on the basis of a sanguine reveal reading that the ministry considered an illegal diagnostic tool. He was doing this on the same night that the wizarding world had experienced its most significant political upheaval in a generation. He was doing this to the child who had apparently just become the most famous living person in wizarding Britain. And he was doing it because the most respected man in that world had been stealing from this infant for, possibly, the entirety of his short life, and no one had noticed or cared or stopped it, and the child had been left in the cold under a dead bush by someone who believed so thoroughly in his own authority that he had not for 1 second considered that anyone might question it. Griphook pressed the activation point. The world turned inside out, briefly and unpleasantly, the way portkey travel always did. Goblins found it considerably more disorienting than humans, something to do with their innate sensitivity to spatial magic. And then he was standing in a stone corridor that smelled of deep earth and old metal and the peculiar dry warmth of a space heated by magical sources rather than fire. Gringotts. The deep levels. Below the public vaults, below the secondary archives, below the levels that human cursebreakers had clearance to access. The Iron Maw clan's operational chambers. 2 guards materialized from the shadows immediately, goblins in full Warcraft armor, short swords drawn, moving with the fluid efficiency of people who had trained for this since before they could walk. They stopped when they saw Griphook. They looked at the child. "War Chief," said the taller one. His name was Broadfong and he had the flat, watchful expression of someone who had seen a great deal in his career and had learned to react rather than emote. "Is that, yes," said Griphook. A pause. "The Potter child." "Yes." Another pause, longer this time. Broadfong and the other guard, younger, name of Sharpvein, 15 years old and 3 months into his first post, still occasionally startled by things, exchanged a look of the kind that meant an enormous amount was being communicated in approximately no words. "Ragnarok will need to know," said Broadfong. "I know," said Griphook. "I'll tell him myself. Get a blood ward on this corridor and have healercraft sent to Chamber 7. The child needs assessment." He didn't wait for acknowledgement. He walked down the corridor toward Chamber 7 with the sleeping child against his shoulder and the cold, steady certainty of someone who had made a decision and was not going to second-guess it. The healercraft assessment took 2 hours. Goblin healers were not the same as wizarding healers. They were not the same as Muggle doctors. They were something older than either, practitioners of a discipline that the wizarding world, in its comfortable arrogance, had assumed was primitive because it used tools instead of wands, because it read the body the way a scholar reads a text rather than the way a mechanic repairs a machine. The lead healer, a woman named Thornwick who was 90 years old and had the bedside manner of someone who had long since stopped caring what anyone thought of her, worked in silence broken only by the sounds of her instruments and the occasional gobbledygook notation she made in a ledger, and when she was done she looked at Griphook across the chamber table with an expression he recognized as the goblin equivalent of controlled fury. "Malnutrition," she said. "Moderate hypothermia, resolved now. 2 untreated lacerations on the hands and a contusion on the left shoulder consistent with being placed, not set down, placed, in a confined space. These are not the primary concerns." She put her instruments down with a care that had a controlled quality to it, like someone setting down something they wanted to throw. "His magical core is at 31% of standard capacity for a child of his age and lineage." Griphook already knew this. Hearing it stated in a healer's flat, clinical voice made it more real in a way that was unpleasant. "The siphon was active when you found him?" "Yes. I severed it," said Griphook. He had done that before the portkey, with a small cutting instrument from his case, slipping the thin magical thread of it the way you'd slip a parasite from a wound. The child hadn't even woken. "Is there permanent damage?" Thornwick made a sound that was not quite a word. She picked up one instrument and set it down again. Unknown, she said finally. The core is intact. The structure is, there are signs of what I would describe as managed depletion. Like a well that has been drawn from very carefully, not drained carelessly. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. They were not harming him in ways that would kill or permanently cripple. They were, she paused, choosing her word, managing him. Keeping the level low enough to suppress certain developmental markers without preventing core function. Development markers, Griphook said quietly. Such as. A child of this lineage, at full capacity, would by 12 months of age be demonstrating spontaneous, significant wandless magic. The kind that gets noticed. The kind that would make it very difficult for any guardian, however trusted and beloved, to quietly influence the child's development or placement without other powerful witches and wizards paying close attention. Thornwick looked at him with eyes that had been watching powerful people make terrible choices for the better part of a century. At 31%, he is merely an impressive infant with an unusual scar. Easily managed. Easily placed. Easily, overseen. The word sat in the chamber like something with weight. What happens, Griphook said, when the siphon stays severed and his core begins to recover? He will become, over the course of the next few years, one of the most magically powerful children born in this century. Thornwick said it with the same tone she might have said the weather will improve by Thursday. The Potter and black lines together are already significant. The Peveril inheritance, which your sanguine reveal apparently flagged, has not manifested in a living child for 3 generations. With the suppression removed and the core allowed to grow normally, yes. Significant. And whoever removed that siphon would have access to that excess no longer, Griphook said. Whoever installed that siphon, Thornwick said, with a precision that had a blade in it, would notice within a day or two that the feed had gone silent. And would begin asking questions. The silence that followed had the quality of a military briefing. How long before the child is stable enough to travel? He is stable now. He needs feeding and warmth and sleep, none of which require my continued presence. Thornwick closed her ledger. War Chief. She said his title the way his grandmother had said it, not as a formality but as a thing with meaning. What you have brought in here tonight, I want to be clear about what it is. This is not a stray. This is not a vault matter or a contract dispute. This is the child that the entire wizarding world currently believes is sitting safely at his aunt's house in Surrey under Albus Dumbledore's careful protection. She looked at him steadily. Ragnarok will not thank you for this. No, Griphook agreed. He won't. And you're going to do it anyway. Griphook looked at the child sleeping on the chamber table, wrapped now in a healer's warming cloth, his magic still thin and guttering but steadier, the hollowness in it fractionally less now that the drain had stopped. The green eyes were closed. The lightning bolt scar caught the chamber's low light. I found him under a bush, Griphook said. In the dark. In November. Left there like something that wasn't wanted. He paused. And the most powerful wizard in Britain had a feeding tube in his magic. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Thornwick nodded once, the sharp, definitive nod of someone who had made up their mind about something they had already made up their mind about. She gathered her instruments. At the chamber door she stopped without turning around. I'll mark this as an anonymous vault ward retrieval in the medical log, she said. Standard procedure for infants brought in without documentation. It buys you perhaps 72 hours before anyone in administration notices the discrepancy. Then she was gone, and Griphook was alone in the chamber with the child and the low hum of the deep vault heating and the distant sound of the underground river that ran beneath this level of Gringotts, 200 feet below London streets. He sat down in the chamber chair. He was not a man who second-guessed himself, as a general principle. He had found that it was a waste of cognitive resources that could be better spent on what to do next. But he sat in the chair for several minutes and let himself look at the child, really look, not as a healer assessing, not as a bloodreader reading a result, but as, himself, Griphook, war chief of Ironmaw clan, 31 years old, who had walked into this night expecting a political reconnaissance and had come back with something else entirely. The child's chest rose and fell with the steady rhythm of deep sleep. His color was better already. The bluish tinge had gone from his lips. He had one fist curled under his chin and the warming cloth pulled up around him by some sleeping instinct, and he looked, small and resilient and entirely unaware of the magnitude of what had been done to him and the magnitude of what was probably coming. Griphook thought about Dumbledore. He thought about the letter in his inner pocket, the confident 3 paragraphs, the tone of someone arranging pieces on a board that they believed, unquestionably, was theirs to play. He thought about the word Thornwick had used, managing, and the quiet, meticulous precision of the siphon's construction, the care taken to keep the depletion just below the threshold that might raise alarms. He had read the files on Albus Dumbledore that Gringotts maintained on all major wizarding figures. They were extensive. Dumbledore was, by any measure, a genuine force for good. He had opposed Grindelwald when others looked away, he had built Hogwarts into a genuine institution of learning, he had spent decades fighting the darkness with what appeared to be sincere conviction. He was not a petty man. He was not a simple villain. He was a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that his judgment was so good and his cause so just that the normal rules, the rules about consent, about other people's autonomy, about the ownership of one's own self and one's own magic, simply didn't apply to him. That he could steal from a child because he knew better than anyone how that child's power should be used. That he could leave an infant in the cold because he had calculated that the wards on the house outweighed the danger, and he was so accustomed to being right that the calculation had felt, to him, like certainty. That was the most dangerous kind of wrong. Griphook stood up. He checked the child one more time, breathing even, color good, magic still thin but no longer dropping, and walked out of Chamber 7 and up 3 levels to the administrative corridor where Ragnar's private offices occupied a series of interconnected rooms that no human had ever entered and several humans had unwisely tried to enter and had been located later in states of considerable dishevelment. He knocked. "Enter," said a voice like stone grinding against stone. Ragnar was old. He was very old. His precise age was a matter of some internal goblin debate and he had never seen fit to resolve it, which was itself a statement about the nature of his authority. He had been Goblin King for long enough that the question of his age had become, like many things about him, simply part of the geography. He was sitting behind a desk that was made from a single piece of black rock, reading what appeared to be 3 separate documents simultaneously, and he looked up at Griphook with eyes that were the color of hammered bronze and had the same quality, something valuable, ancient, and entirely unyielding. "Griphook," he said. "I'm told you've returned from Surrey with a rather notable passenger." "Yes," said Griphook. "Sit down and tell me what you found." Griphook sat. He told it clean and straight, the way he always reported, facts first, implications second, recommendation last, no editorializing in the middle. The child under the bush. The magical depletion. The sanguine reveal. The siphon. Dumbledore's signature. The healer's assessment. He laid the letter on Ragnar's desk without comment. Ragnar read the letter. He read it twice. Then he set it down with the same careful precision that Thornwick had used putting her instruments away, the precision of someone managing a feeling. "You severed the siphon," Ragnar said. "Yes. Before you'd consulted with anyone. Before you'd made any report. Before you'd considered the political ramifications. Yes." A pause. "You understand what Dumbledore will do when he notices it's gone." "Yes." Griphook kept his eyes on Ragnar's. "He will look for the child. He will assume the siphon was disrupted by something ambient, a ward interaction, a random magical event. He will check the Dursley house first. When he doesn't find the child there, he will widen his search. But my instruments were precise, and I left no trace, and the sanguine reveal was performed without a wand, which means there is nothing for any wizarding diagnostic to detect." He paused. "He will not look here. Not immediately. The relationship between Gringotts and the Ministry is governed by treaties that prevent Ministry surveillance of Gringotts' operations. He knows the treaties. He also knows, Ragnarok said quietly, that those treaties have limits. And that a goblin found walking Surrey streets on the same night the Potter child disappeared will eventually become relevant to his calculations. Eventually, Griphook agreed. By which time I hope to have made his options significantly more limited. Ragnarok looked at him for a long time. The bronze eyes moved over Griphook's face with the thoroughness of someone reading very fine print. You want to keep the child, Ragnarok said. Griphook said nothing. You walked in here with a human infant, evidence of a crime committed by the most politically connected wizard in Britain, and a plan that will require us to either defend this action publicly, which means invoking the sanguine reveal as evidence, a document that the Ministry will immediately attempt to suppress, or hide it indefinitely, which will eventually collapse. Ragnarok leaned back in his chair. The chair was large and carved and it made him look smaller against it, which was, Griphook had always suspected, entirely deliberate. Tell me why. You've read the healer's assessment. I have. Then you know what he will be. When the siphon stays severed and his core grows. Griphook kept his voice level. A child of Potter, Black, and Peveril lineage, at full capacity, reaching Hogwarts age. That child, depending on who raised him and what they taught him, could be the single most significant counterweight to Ministry and Dumbledore influence that our people have seen in a century. Or he could be Dumbledore's perfectly managed weapon, siphon reinstated the moment he is returned, raised to be grateful and trusting and entirely, willingly used. Ragnarok's expression didn't change. And you believe you can raise him to be the former? I believe I can raise him to be himself, Griphook said, and heard, faintly, his grandmother's voice in the words. Another long pause. The underground river made its distant sound. Somewhere in the deep vaults, something ancient shifted in the way that old magical objects shifted when they responded to changes in the magical atmosphere above them, the collective instinct of kept power, sensing a change in the weather. There will be conditions, Ragnarok said finally. Of course. He will be raised under Ironmaw clan protection. He will not be hidden. If Dumbledore finds him, we deal with it formally, through treaty mechanisms, not by fleeing or concealing. Our position must always be that we found an abandoned, medically compromised child and invoked our right of wardship under the Accord of 1792. Ragnarok picked up the letter from his desk and held it. This letter, combined with the Sanguine Reveal record, will be archived in the restricted vault under my personal seal. Not destroyed. Preserved. Intact and inviolable. His eyes met Griphook's. Because someday that child is going to want to know what was done to him. And it will not be our place to decide what he does with that knowledge. Griphook nodded. One more thing, Ragnarok said. He set the letter down. The bronze eyes held something that was, in a creature capable of it, close to something private. I have been Goblin King for longer than most wizards have been alive. I have watched our people treated as instruments, useful, kept, never quite equal, by every administration this ministry has produced. I have made accommodations I am not proud of because the alternative was worse. He paused. This boy, if he grows up here, if he grows up knowing, he will not make those accommodations easily. No, said Griphook. Good, said Ragnarok, and for a moment his face held something that might, in a different creature, have been called a smile. It was brief and it did not quite reach his eyes, which were still bronze and still hard, but it was there. Take the child to your quarters. I'll have Thornwick send a night nurse. And Griphook, he said, as Griphook reached the door. Griphook turned. You did not find a political asset tonight, Ragnarok said quietly. You found a child. Do not forget which one you are responsible for. Griphook held the Goblin King's gaze for a moment. I know what I found, he said. He went back to Chamber 7. He lifted the sleeping child from the table, and this time when the boy stirred against his shoulder, the small fist clutching at his cloak, Griphook did not think about consequences or politics or the magnitude of what he'd set in motion. He just walked down the corridor toward his quarters, carrying Harry Potter through the deep dark of a world that had, this night, changed its shape entirely. Above them, London went about its unknowing business. In Little Whinging, the hydrangea bush shivered in a wind that had nothing magical in it. In the offices of half a dozen wizarding households, owls were departing and arriving with news about the Dark Lord's fall, about the miraculous survival, about the boy who lived. In a cottage in Wiltshire, Albus Dumbledore sat in a chair by a fire and felt, with the sensitivity of a man who had been attuned to a particular magical thread for the better part of a year, the thread go silent. He sat with that silence for a long time. Then he began to think. Chapter 2, the raising. The first word Harry Potter said was grack. It was not an English word. It was gobbledygook, specifically, the gobbledygook for give, which in the Ironmaw dialect carried a secondary meaning closer to that belongs to me and I will have it, and he said it at 14 months old, reaching across the table in Griphook's quarters toward a bowl of spiced mushroom broth that Thornwick had approved for his diet and that he had apparently decided he was going to feed himself from that point on, regardless of what anyone else thought about it. Griphook had looked at the child, then at the bowl, then back at the child. He had slid the bowl across the table. Harry had gotten broth absolutely everywhere and eaten about half of it and looked profoundly satisfied. Thornwick, who had come in during the process, made a note in her ledger with the expression of someone recording a significant data point. Vocabulary acquisition ahead of schedule, she said. Motor development normal. Magical signature, she ran her instrument over him, the one that read like a slow tide coming in, up to 47%. Core is growing. The suppression effects are clearing faster than I projected. Is that a problem? Griphook asked. Thornwick considered the child, who was now examining the bowl with the focused attention of someone who suspected it had more broth in it and was determining the best strategy. It will be, she said, when his accidental magic starts manifesting at full strength and we need to reinforce the ward seals on your quarters. She was right about that. By 18 months the accidental magic was a daily event, small things, mostly, objects sliding across surfaces toward Harry's hands, lights brightening when he was happy, a persistent warmth in whatever room he was currently occupying that had nothing to do with the heating. At 2 years old, when he went through a phase of extreme frustration with a particular carved wooden puzzle that Broadfong had given him, the puzzle spontaneously disassembled itself into its component pieces, laid them out in order, and then reassembled itself in about 4 seconds. Harry stared at it. Then he looked at Griphook with an expression of profound vindication. Did you do that? Griphook asked. Harry pointed at the puzzle. Then at himself. Then at the puzzle again. The vocabulary for I did and it did were still sorting themselves out in his head. He was working simultaneously in gobbledygook and English, the two languages braided together in his developing mind with the easy fluency of someone who had never known a world where only one of them existed. I'll take that as yes, Griphook said. He picked up the puzzle, examined it, set it back down. Do it again. Harry did it again. This time faster. Again, said Griphook. Slower. Watch what you're doing when you do it. This was, in retrospect, the foundation of everything. Not the formal teaching, which came later. Not the rune lessons or the blade training or the history sessions in Ragnarok's archive rooms. It was this, the simple, consistent insistence on watch what you're doing when you do it, that shaped the way Harry's magic developed. Not as something that happened to him, not as something external and mysterious, but as something he was doing, consciously, with intent and attention. Most wizarding children grew up being told not to do magic outside of school, not to do magic without a wand, not to do magic in front of muggles. The first relationship most of them had with their own power was a series of prohibitions. Harry's first relationship with his was a bowl of mushroom broth and a carved wooden puzzle and someone who looked at what he could do and said again, slower, watch. He grew up in the deep levels of Gringotts and in the Ironmaw clan's mountain halls in Scotland, a place that muggles walked past as a stretch of unremarkable moorland and that revealed itself, to those with the eyes for it, as a complex of stone buildings built into the hillside rather than on top of it, warm and deep-ceilinged and lit by the particular amber quality of Goblin-made lights that never flickered and never went cold. He was not, by any meaningful measure, isolated. The clan numbered close to 300, and the deep levels of Gringotts had another 200 operational staff on any given day, and Harry moved through both with the unself-conscious ease of a child who had never been told he didn't belong. He was different, obviously, visibly different, tall for the space by the time he was 3 and taller still by 5, green eyes standing out among the amber and black of Goblin eyes, his hair a chaos that no ironmaw braiding convention had ever managed to fully domesticate. He was different, and it didn't appear to bother him because it had never been presented to him as something that should. The children his approximate age, Goblin children, developed on a different timeline, but several of the clan's young were in a developmental range that translated to roughly 6 to 8 during Harry's early years, took about a week to decide he was acceptable, and thereafter treated him with the matter-of-fact inclusion of people who had never thought to do otherwise. He fought with them, trained with them, ate with them, got into trouble with them. When a boy named Coppervein decided, at age 7, to test whether the lower vault drainage tunnels were navigable by raft, they were not, as it turned out, and the retrieval operation required 3 adults and a rope. Harry was in the raft. When the same group worked out, at age 8, that a specific combination of rune chalk and vault stone produced a flash of light bright enough to be temporarily blinding, Harry was the one who suggested they test it at a range of 10 feet before declaring victory. "You have a talent," Coppervein's mother told Griphook at a clan gathering, not entirely approvingly, for thinking about consequences before they happen. "He's learning," Griphook said. Learning was, in fact, approximately half of Harry's waking life. The Goblins did not have schools in the wizarding sense, they had apprenticeship, which was less formal and considerably more demanding, because it placed you alongside someone who actually did the thing rather than someone who taught the theory of the thing and hoped you'd work out the practice yourself. Harry was formally apprenticed to Griphook in the study of bloodcraft and inheritance law, which was partly Griphook's area of expertise and partly a pragmatic decision about what Harry would eventually need. Alongside that, he worked with the clan's senior runesmith, a woman named Ironvale who was 60 and had the patience of a glacier and the standards of someone who had never in her life accepted work that was merely good when excellent was available. Again, Ironvale said, looking at a rune sequence Harry had carved into a practice slate. He was 6 years old. The sequence was technically accurate, every stroke correct, every proportion within acceptable variance. Ironvale picked up the slate and held it at a slight angle, examining it the way a gemcutter examines a stone they're considering. "What does this do?" "It seals," said Harry. He'd been staring at rune sequences since he was old enough to hold a stylus. He knew what this one did. A containing ward. Level 3. "What doesn't it do?" Pause. He looked at the sequence again. Saw it, the join between the second and third rune, slightly too close, the spacing off by a margin that was within technical tolerance but that, over time, under sustained magical pressure, would introduce a vibration in the ward's field. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But eventually. It won't hold under sustained pressure. The join is weak. Why? I was going too fast. Why were you going too fast? Harry said nothing for a moment. Then, because I knew I was getting it right and I stopped paying attention to getting it right and started thinking about being finished. Ironvale set the slate down and handed him a fresh one. Again, she said, with a quality in the word that was not unkind. He did it again. Slower. The way Griphook had told him to do the puzzle. The blade training was different, faster, more physical, with a feedback mechanism that required no explanation because failure to pay attention produced immediate and concrete consequences that went away quickly but made their point. Goblin warcraft was not the same as wizarding dueling. It did not use wands. It used the body and the blade and, for those with the capacity, the integration of direct wandless magic with physical combat in a way that wizarding theory almost never developed because wizarding children were handed wands at 11 and thereafter ceased to develop the muscle, literal and metaphorical, of raw, unmediated magical output. Harry's magical output had been, since Thornwick removed the last traces of the siphon's effects at age 3, substantial. By age 7 it was remarkable. By age 9 it was the kind of thing that made experienced magical practitioners stop what they were doing and recalibrate their sense of what was possible. He didn't shoot fireballs or level walls. It wasn't like that. It was more like pressure. A quality of presence. When Harry walked into a space with intent, the magic in that space moved, the way water moves when something large enters it. It wasn't showy. It was structural. It was the kind of power that didn't announce itself but was felt by anyone sensitive enough to feel it, and among the Ironmaw clan, who were all sensitive enough to feel it, it had become simply part of the landscape of knowing Harry, something you factored in, something that had been true for so long it had stopped being remarkable and become just his. He was 9 when Ragnarok first brought him into an administrative session. It was not a planned thing. Harry had been in the archive rooms working on an inheritance research assignment, tracking the Potter line backward through 4 generations as a practical exercise in reading old Sanguine Reveal records, when a message came through from one of Ragnarok's advisors asking Griphook to attend an emergency session regarding a ministry attempt to renegotiate the terms of the banking treaty. Griphook had looked at the message and then at Harry and made a decision that he later described as expedient. "Come," he said. "Sit in the back. Don't speak unless I tell you to." Harry closed his research and came. He sat in the back of the council chamber, which was a rough stone room with a long table and enough magical containment in the walls to hold a small war. He watched as Ragnarok and 6 senior advisors dealt with 2 ministry representatives, a man named Fudge who was sweating in a way that suggested he was aware he was outmatched, and a woman named Umbridge in a pink cardigan who was not sweating and was therefore more dangerous, who were attempting, with varying degrees of diplomatic delicacy, to propose a review of the clause in the banking treaty that prevented ministry surveillance of Gringotts operations. Harry watched Ragnarok listen to the proposal. He watched the Goblin King's face, perfectly still, perfectly courteous, giving nothing, and then watched him begin to speak, and it was a masterclass in the specific art of winning an argument by making the other person explain, in their own words, the exact nature of their intentions, until those intentions were sitting in the middle of the table where everyone could see them clearly. By the end of the session, Fudge was agreeing to a counterproposal that gave the ministry significantly less than what they'd come in hoping for, and Umbridge was smiling the smile of someone who would not forget this and was already planning her next approach, and the ministry representatives left, and Ragnarok looked at Harry in the back of the chamber. "What did you observe?" he said. Harry thought for a moment. The woman in pink never said what she actually wanted. She let the man do all the talking. Why? Because if she said it and you refused, she'd have spent her position. He can be replaced. She was keeping herself available for the next conversation. Ragnarok regarded him with the bronze eyes. Then he looked at Griphook. "Bring him to the next session as well," he said. The next session. And the one after. It became, not formally but structurally, part of Harry's education, the vault room and the rune slate and the blade training and now the council sessions, where he sat and watched and afterward answered questions about what he'd seen with the increasing sophistication of someone who was beginning to understand that power was not only in fighting or in magic but in information, in patience, in knowing when to speak and when to let someone else speak until they'd said more than they meant to. He was happy. This is worth saying plainly, because the narrative of Harry Potter as the wizarding world understood it was a narrative of deprivation and resilience, the orphan who survived, who endured, who triumphed despite everything that was done to him. There was truth in the framework. Things had been done to him. But in the deep halls of Ironmaw and the amber-lit corridors of Gringotts' lower levels, Harry Potter grew up happy, with the grounded, specific happiness of someone who knows where they belong and feels, daily, concretely, that they are valued. He was not coddled. Goblin parenting, if Griphook's particular approach could be called that, and Harry, by the time he was 6, had entirely ceased to think of it in any other terms, the way you cease to think of breathing as a choice, did not produce coddled children. You were expected to try hard things and fail and try again. You were expected to contribute. You were expected, from an age that might have seemed early by other cultural standards, to have opinions and defend them and update them when the facts required it. You were not expected to be grateful for existing or to perform smallness to make the people around you comfortable. Harry Potter, raised by Griphook of Clan Ironmaw, was one of the least small people you could imagine. He was also, genuinely, surprisingly funny, quick-tongued in both his languages, with a sense of humor that tended toward the dry and the situational and the precise observation. He made Griphook laugh, on a semi-regular basis, with the expression of someone who had not expected to laugh and was mildly annoyed about it. He made Ragnarok laugh exactly once, age 8, some comment about the structural absurdity of ministry inheritance law that hit a specific frequency, and the Goblin King looked so startled by the sound coming out of himself that Harry had gone very still and then, carefully, not said anything about it. There were hard things too. At 4, he had asked Griphook who his parents were. This was not a surprising question, it had been anticipated, discussed in some depth between Griphook and Thornwick and, obliquely, Ragnarok, and Griphook had answered it with the directness that was, by then, the only mode Harry knew how to receive. James and Lily Potter. Dead. Killed by a dark wizard named Voldemort on the night of October 31st, 1981. You were there. You survived. The scar on your forehead is where his curse hit you and failed. The reason it failed, the full reason, the magical mechanics of it, is something we are still researching, because it involves a form of sacrificial magic that has not been well documented and you deserve a complete answer rather than a partial one. Harry had been quiet for a long time after that. He was 4, and 4-year-olds process grief differently than older people, not with less depth, but with less vocabulary for it, so it came out sideways, in the dream he had twice that week about green light, in a brief period of aggressive frustration with the wooden puzzle that had long since become too easy for him, in a question he asked 3 days later that was, would they have taught me gobbledygook? Griphook had thought about that carefully. Your mother was Muggle-born, he said. She was said to be exceptional at languages. I think she might have tried. Harry seemed to file this information somewhere specific. What were they like? I never met them, Griphook said honestly. What I know is what I've read in the records and what the clan's informants reported over the years. Your father was reckless and loyal. Your mother was sharp and considerably more strategic than anyone gave her credit for. He paused. You have her eyes. Harry touched his own face, very briefly, with the ghost of an expression that was private and not for anyone else, and then he picked up his practice stylus and went back to the rune sequence he'd been working on. At 7, he had asked about the siphon. This was harder. Griphook had known it was coming, had known it, in fact, from the night in Chamber 7 when Ragnarok had said that child is going to want to know what was done to him, and had prepared for it with the thoroughness he brought to all important things. He had, with Thornwick's assistance, put together a clear explanation of what a magical siphon was and how the one placed on Harry had worked and what its effects had been on his development. And he had told Harry, cleanly and without editorialization, who had placed it. Harry had listened to all of this with the focused, still quality he brought to complicated information, the same quality he brought to a difficult rune sequence or a council session he was trying to understand. He asked 3 clarifying questions. How long had it been active before Griphook found him? What was the siphon's builder doing with the extracted magic? Was the siphon builder still alive and still in power? To the first question, the full-depth analysis Thornwick had done when Harry was 3, with the complete instrument set, suggested installation within the first few weeks of his life. To the second, that was a question the restricted vault's records could speak to, and he was old enough to read them if he wanted to. To the third, yes. Albus Dumbledore was still alive, still headmaster of Hogwarts, still chief warlock, still supreme mugwump. Still, as far as any of Gringotts' networks could determine, still at the center of British wizarding political life. Still looking for me? Harry asked. Not actively, as far as we can determine, Griphook said. His initial search in 1981 was significant. After 6 months, it appears he concluded that the siphon's disruption was caused by some ambient effect and that you had been, he chose the word deliberately, lost in the chaos of that night. There are records in the ministry's sealed files suggesting he believes you deceased. Harry considered this. He was 7, sitting cross-legged on the vault-room floor with his practice blade across his knees. They'd just finished a training session, and he had the particular quality of stillness that he shared, Griphook had long since noticed, with the clan's best fighters. Not the stillness of someone who wasn't moving. The stillness of someone deciding what move to make. "He'll find out I'm not," Harry said. "Eventually." "Yes," Griphook agreed. "Hogwarts letters are generated by a charm that responds to magical signatures. When you're 11, the charm will find you regardless of what we've done to our wards. It cannot be fooled indefinitely. And then he'll know I'm alive." "Yes." Harry turned the practice blade over in his hands. The blade was real. The Ironmaw clan did not train with blunted weapons after age 5, on the basis that if you learned caution with a real blade you would have the real habit, not the approximation. It was short-bladed, dark-metalled, with a handle that Harry had rewound twice because his hands were growing. "What happens when he knows I'm alive and I'm here?" "That," said Griphook, "is what we're going to be ready for." He watched Harry think about this, watched the calculation behind the green eyes, the particular way his mind worked, the quality that was absolutely his mother's and that Griphook recognized now across years of watching it operate. Lily Potter, the restricted vault record suggested, had been a strategic thinker of unusual ability. She had also, according to every account Griphook had found, been deeply, genuinely kind, not softly kind, but the harder kind, the kind that told the truth when lying would have been easier, that stood where it said it would stand. "I want to read the vault records," Harry said. "I know," said Griphook. "After your next rune assessment." Harry uncrossed his legs, stood, and sheathed the practice blade in one motion. "Tomorrow." "The assessment is tomorrow," Griphook said. "The records are the day after." He read them. All of them, the sanguine reveal from that first night, the healer's reports, the restricted vault files, the informant's records, the thin and damning thread of documentation that Gringotts had been building around Albus Dumbledore for 30 years without having, until that November night in 1981, any single piece of evidence specific enough to act on. He read for 2 days and came out of the vault room with the same quality of stillness he'd gone in with, except that now there was something underneath it that Griphook recognized because he had felt something similar on the night he'd read the sanguine reveal in the cold on Privet Drive. Not rage. Not yet, or not simply. Something more structural than rage. The feeling of understanding something completely and clearly and knowing that this understanding would, in time, have consequences. "He thought I was a tool," Harry said. He was standing in the corridor outside the vault room, and he said it in the flat tone of someone stating a fact that they have fully processed and do not need to process again. "He was managing me. Managing what I'd be, what I'd do, who would trust me and who I'd trust. It was all structured. Even leaving me at that house was structured." "Yes," Griphook said. "And he's been doing it to other children. The records suggest at least 3 others across 40 years. All powerful children who grew up to be exceptional, but not as exceptional as their lineage or their early magical indicators suggested they should be." Harry was quiet. The amber light of the corridor caught his face. He was 7 and he looked younger than that, and also somehow older, and Griphook found himself thinking, not for the first time, that the child was going to be something extraordinary and he was going to be something that Dumbledore had absolutely not intended. "I want to be stronger than him," Harry said. Not angry. Not dramatic. The tone of someone setting a benchmark. Not for revenge. So that when we do this, when we put the record in front of people who have the power to act on it, he can't make it go away. "That," said Griphook, "is exactly the right reason." Harry was 9 when the first owl found him. Not a Hogwarts owl, that was still 2 years away. This was a ministry owl, fat and self-important, carrying a routine magical census inquiry that was sent annually to all registered wizarding households and a small number of unusual locations that the ministry tracked through means that were technically extra-treaty but that everyone pretended didn't exist. The fact that it found its way to the Ironmaw Mountain halls meant that somewhere in the ministry's registers, Harry's magical signature had been ticked as unaccounted for and someone had set an owl to follow it. Griphook intercepted the owl. He read the census form. He filled it out: magical child, ward status, currently under Gringotts' care pending heritage determination, not currently enrolled in formal magical education, health status satisfactory, and sent the owl back with the form and a separate sealed document citing Clause 14 of the 1792 Accord, which entitled Gringotts to wardship of any magical minor found in circumstances of neglect or abandonment, and which the ministry could challenge only in the Goblin High Court, a process that would take a minimum of 3 years and require the ministry to reveal the basis for their concern, which would in turn require them to acknowledge that they had known Harry Potter's location was uncertain for 7 years without doing anything about it. The owl did not come back. But it had found him. And that meant other things could find him too. The timeline was tightening. Griphook began the next phase of Harry's education. The political education, the council sessions, the treaty reading, the careful unpicking of how wizarding law and goblin law overlapped and diverged and where, in those overlaps and divergences, leverage could be found, intensified. The blade training moved from the fundamentals into the advanced forms, the ones that integrated magical discharge with physical combat. Ironvale began teaching Harry the higher-order rune sequences, the ones that could hold not just objects but intentions, that could seal not just vaults but agreements, that could expose not just inheritance but deception, the sanguine reveals architectural cousins. And Griphook, for the first time, began to talk to Harry about what was coming. Not in terms of preparation for threat, Harry was not afraid of Dumbledore, did not appear to experience his existence as a threat in any personal sense, which was either admirable or alarming depending on how you looked at it, but in terms of strategy. The record in the vault is powerful, Griphook told him. The sanguine reveal from that first night is irrefutable. But the wizarding world will not simply accept it because it is true. Truth requires a platform. It requires the right moment, the right audience, the right framing. You mean we have to pick our ground, Harry said. He was 9.5 and they were in the war room, a smaller chamber adjacent to the council room where the clan's tactical planning happened. There was a map on the table, not of a battlefield but of wizarding Britain's institutional landscape, the Wisengamot and the Ministry and Hogwarts and the International Confederation, with lines drawn between them showing influence and dependency and the places where a single significant shift could move multiple things at once. Harry had drawn most of it himself, over the course of 6 months of research. Yes, said Griphook. Hogwarts is the platform, Harry said, looking at the map. Not because it's Dumbledore's ground, or partly because it is. It puts me in direct contact with the wizarding world, in a setting where he can't simply make me disappear again because there are too many witnesses. And when I go to claim my vault, that's the trigger, Griphook agreed. The formal inheritance ritual at Gringotts, done on record, in public, the blood result goes into the Gringotts ledger. The ledger is treaty-protected information that the ministry cannot seal without a full treaty renegotiation. Dumbledore can influence many things. He cannot influence the Gringotts ledger. Harry put his finger on the map, on the small square that represented Gringotts London. Then he moved it to the square for Hogwarts. Then he looked up with those green eyes that were so entirely, devastatingly his mother's. How much time do we have? Until you're 11 and the Hogwarts letter arrives? 18 months. Then we have work to do, Harry said, and turned back to the map. Those 18 months were dense. Harry absorbed everything Griphook put in front of him and asked for more. He spent 3 weeks in the restricted archive reading everything documented about Dumbledore, his rise, his politics, his known associations, his publicly stated beliefs. He spent another 2 weeks reading about Lily and James Potter, building a picture of his parents that was his own, not handed to him, constructed from primary sources and cross-referenced records and the accounts of people who had known them. He discovered that his father had been an orar and a Quidditch player of some skill. He discovered that his mother had, at 16, outperformed every OWL candidate in her year in charms and arithmancy. He discovered that Lily Potter had, in the months before her death, been doing independent research into a branch of sacrificial magic so rare and so specific that there were fewer than 20 documented cases of it in the entire history of wizarding Britain. He stared at this piece of information for a long time. He noted, in the margin of his research notes, in gobbledygook, the word for deliberate. He turned 11 on July 31, 1991. In the morning, Griphook gave him a blade, not a practice blade, a real one, the shortest of the war forms, designed for the period before a young goblin took their full warcraft assessment. It was made of the dark metal that didn't have an English name, and the handle was wrapped in leather with a single Ironmaw rune burned into it. Truthfinder, the rune read. Or, in the more extended translation, that which cuts through to what is real. Harry turned it over in his hands and looked at Griphook and didn't say anything for a moment. For what's coming, Griphook said. Yeah, said Harry. He was 11 and he was already taller than Griphook by a head, and he had a chaos of black hair and green eyes and a lightning bolt scar and a goblin-forged blade in his hands and the easy, grounded confidence of someone who knew exactly who they were. Are we ready? Griphook thought about a freezing November night on a Surrey street. A bundle under a hydrangea. A magical thread running toward a house in Wiltshire. A child with blue lips looking up at him with green eyes. I was ready 9 years ago, he said. The question was always whether you would be. Harry's mouth curved. And? Go get your things, Griphook said. The London portkey is at noon. Harry went. And the blade at his hip caught the amber vault light as he moved, and the rune on its handle caught it too, and Griphook stood in the corridor and felt, underneath the strategic clarity and the political preparation and the very practical awareness of everything that was about to get complicated, something he was going to continue to privately call professional satisfaction, because a war chief of Clan Ironmaw didn't have other kinds of feelings. The underground river ran its course below them. London waited above. Chapter 3, The world above the portkey deposited them in a maintenance corridor behind Gringotts service entrance on a Tuesday morning in late July, and the first thing Harry Potter experienced of the wizarding world was the smell. Diagon Alley in summer smelled of ink and old parchment and something sweet and slightly singed, like caramel that had been left on the heat a beat too long, and underneath all of that the particular magical quality of a dense concentration of active spells in a confined space, warm, faintly electric, like the air before a storm that was actually going to arrive rather than threaten and pass. Harry stood in the maintenance corridor for a moment and just breathed it in, cataloging. Different from the vaults, he said. The vaults smell of kept magic, Griphook said, moving past him toward the service door. This smells of used magic. There's a distinction. I like the vaults better. You'll get used to it. The service door opened onto a narrow side passage that joined the main Gringotts atrium, and Harry's first view of the bank he'd been technically living in for the better part of a decade, or rather, the public face of it, the face it showed to the wizarding world, was a sensory adjustment that took about 15 seconds. He'd seen drawings, schematics, architectural records. The drawings hadn't fully communicated the scale of it, the soaring marble columns, the 100-odd goblins working at their counters with the purposeful efficiency of a machine that had been running for centuries and intended to keep running for several more, the general air of a place where transactions happened and gold changed hands, and no one had ever, in the history of the institution, been permitted to leave having gotten the better of it. Several of the counter-goblins looked up when Harry and Griphook walked in from the service passage. A few of them held Harry's eyes for an extra beat in the way the clan did, not staring, not performing recognition, just a quiet acknowledgement that meant we know who you are and we have your back, the same acknowledgement he'd gotten from Broad Fong and Sharpvein on his first night in the corridor below. He gave it back with a slight nod, the Ironmaw way, and kept moving. The public queue, Griphook said quietly, steering him toward the main counter, is for show. We're here for 3 things: formal registration of your presence as a living heir, the inheritance ritual, and vault access. All of this happens below. But we start above, on record, in public, where it can be documented and witnessed. Because the documentation is the point, Harry said. The documentation is half the point. The other half, Griphook paused at the main counter, where a goblin named Sharpclaw, not Ironmaw, but Stonehewer clan, one of the 3 clans that staffed Gringotts' public operations, was already waiting, which meant the appointment had been set and the counter had been prepared in advance. The other half is that you are here, publicly, and alive, on a Tuesday morning in July of 1991, which is going to create a very interesting ripple in several directions. Sharpclaw looked at Harry with the professional assessment of someone doing several kinds of calculations simultaneously. "Mr. Potter," he said, and there was something in the formality of the title that had weight to it, the first time Harry had ever been addressed that way, officially, in a public setting with witnesses. "Griphook. We're ready below when you are." "We're ready now," Harry said. Sharpclaw nodded and lifted a section of the counter. They went through. The inheritance chamber was 3 levels below the main floor, accessible by a separate cart track that Harry had used dozens of times in his life, but always from the service side, always going deeper, always toward the dark warm vault levels that felt like home. Going to the inheritance chamber felt like the reverse, not going home but presenting yourself, formally, to a world that had been told a story about you for 10 years and was about to find out how much of it was wrong. The chamber itself was large and circular, the walls covered in the carved record script that Gringotts used for its official documentation, a form of modified runic notation that Harry could read as fluently as English, since he'd been working with Iron Veil since age 5. The chamber held a central basin made of the same dark unnamed metal as his blade, and around the basin 3 senior Gringotts officials in formal attire, 2 Stonehewer and 1 Ironmaw, the Ironmaw being a woman named Flintrock who served as Ragnarok's formal representative to the public banking operations and who gave Harry a nod so slight it was barely visible. 3 human witnesses, too. This had been arranged, 2 solicitors from a firm that handled wizarding estate matters and had a long relationship with Gringotts, and 1 journalist from a publication called the Daily Prophet whom Harry had not been told about but whose presence made immediate, obvious sense. Griphook caught the slightly raised quality of Harry's attention and said nothing. The journalist, a woman, middle-aged, with sharp eyes and quick hands that were already moving toward a notepad, was watching Harry with the controlled excitement of someone who had been told something very interesting was about to happen and was ready to record it. "The formal inheritance ritual of the most ancient and noble house of Potter," Flintrock said, and her voice in the stone chamber had the resonance of something official and irrevocable, "is hereby commenced, with the following witnesses recording. The heir claimant is Harry James Potter, born July 31, 1980, only child of James Charles Potter and Lily Potter née Evans. Gringotts hereby records this claimant as living, present, and in sound mind and body." She looked at Harry. "Your hand over the basin, Mr. Potter, palm down." Harry put his hand over the basin. Flintrock applied the needle, the small ceremonial blade used for inheritance rituals, which goblins had been using for this purpose for 2,000 years and which the ministry had once attempted to replace with a wand-based alternative in 1887, resulting in a diplomatic incident that was still cited in treaty law courses as a case study in how not to approach goblin institutional autonomy. A single drop of blood fell into the basin. The basin responded immediately. The dark metal caught the blood and the blood spread and the chamber filled with light, gold for the Potter line, steady and deep, and silver for the black connection through Lily's own lineage research. This surprised the solicitors. Harry watched their faces and filed the reaction, and then the Peveril inheritance, which came up in a color that had no English name and that the record script around the walls began translating with the contained urgency of runes that were describing something they found significant. And then red. Not everywhere. Not the flood of red that had come up in the Sanguine reveal on Privet Drive 10 years ago. The siphon was gone, severed by Griphook that first night, its effects cleared from Harry's core by Thornwick over years of careful monitoring. What remained was the record of it, the scarring in the inheritance lines, the forensic evidence of something that had been attached and had run and had been removed, the way a bone healed over a break and showed, to anyone who knew how to read it, exactly what had happened and when. The journalist was writing very fast. The solicitors were looking at each other. Flintrock read the result with the composure of someone who had known what was in it and was now watching other people discover it, which was its own kind of information management. The inheritance ritual of the House of Potter is complete, she said. The result is hereby entered into the Gringotts official ledger. A certified copy will be provided to the heir claimant. A certified copy will be entered into the treaty-protected record as per the Accord of 1792, Clause 9. She paused, precisely long enough for the weight of what she was about to say to land. The siphon notation in the lineage record is unprecedented in the public documentation of this chamber. Gringotts advises that the heir claimant has the right to request a full supplementary report detailing the forensic findings of the notation. Please proceed, Harry said. The journalist stopped writing and looked at him properly for the first time. He looked back at her with the direct, unruffled quality that was simply how he looked at things. She had bright eyes, this journalist, and the sharp-faced expression of someone whose professional instincts were currently fighting with their personal reaction to the situation, and losing on both counts. Rita Skeeter, she said, which was not what journalists were supposed to say in the middle of formal Gringotts proceedings, and Flintrock gave her a look of magnificent disapproval. Ms. Skeeter, Harry said pleasantly, I'll speak to you afterward. He turned back to the basin. The supplementary report took 40 minutes to generate, a full forensic reading of the siphon's architecture as preserved in the lineage scarring, which the Gringotts inheritance records had documented in extraordinary detail because Flintrock had, in preparation for today, specifically arranged for it to be documented in extraordinary detail. The result named the siphon's installer with the same clean certainty that the sanguine reveal had named him 10 years ago. The name went into the ledger. The name went into the treaty-protected record. The journalist's pen moved so fast it was practically smoking. Harry picked up the certified copy of his inheritance record, rolled it, and tucked it inside his jacket with the ease of someone filing something they will need later. He looked at Griphook. Vault? Vault, Griphook agreed. They took the cart deeper, past the levels Harry knew, to the Potter Vault, 7th level, high security, untouched since 1981. Harry had read the vault inventory in the restricted archives. It was substantial. The Potters had been old money in the truest sense, which meant not just gold but objects and documents and things accumulated across generations that were worth considerably more than their material components. The vault door recognized his blood from the inheritance ritual. Gringotts vaults were smarter than most wizards knew, the doors reading magical signature with a precision that no lock-based system could match, and opened with the particular quality of a seal broken for the first time in a long time. The air that came out was old and dry and carried, very faintly, the smell of the magic that had been sealed inside it. Harry stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he walked in. The gold was there, a significant amount, occupying one entire section with the calm indifference of money that has never needed to justify itself. The objects were there too, in glass-fronted cases along the walls, and Harry moved along them with his hands behind his back, reading the labels in the Gringotts notation, cataloging. He did not touch anything yet. He was looking for something specific. He found it in the document section, a sealed box of research parchments, labeled in the vault inventory as LJP Personal Research, Restricted, Do Not Access Without Heir's Authorization. His mother's handwriting on the label was quick and sure, the handwriting of someone who wrote a great deal and had long since stopped being careful about it. He picked up the box. That can be reviewed later, Griphook said from the vault door, not telling him to put it down, just noting. I know, Harry said. He put the box under his arm. He picked up two other things, a photograph album, leather-bound, and a ring that his inheritance record had flagged as the Peveril heirloom, a plain dark band that settled onto his finger with the quality of something finding its way home and seemed, with absolutely no drama, to simply stop being visible unless you were specifically looking for it. I'm ready. They rode the cart back up. Skeeter was waiting outside the inheritance chamber with the barely contained energy of a person sitting on the story of the decade and trying to look professional about it. She had the notebook and she had a quick quotes quill floating beside her and she had, Harry immediately noticed, already composed her opening paragraph in her head. He could see it in the way her eyes were moving, building sentences. Put the quick quotes quill away, Harry said. She blinked. The quill drooped slightly. I'll talk to you, he said. But I'll talk to you, not a quill. My words, not its interpretation of my words. Agreed? A pause. Skeeter looked at him, this 11-year-old who had walked into a formal inheritance proceeding and directed it with the unhurried confidence of someone who had been thinking about this for considerably longer than she'd been expecting, and made a calculation that was visible in her face. The story was worth it. Agreed, she said. She capped the quill. Good, Harry said. He sat down on the stone bench along the chamber wall. What do you want to know? Everything, Skeeter said, pulling out a second notepad, ordinary, pen-based. Starting with where you've been for 10 years. I've been here, Harry said simply. Gringotts. Under Goblin wardship, as is my legal right under the 1792 Accord. He looked at her steadily. I was found on November 1st, 1981, underneath the front steps of a house in Surrey. Alone. In the cold. An abandoned infant. He let that sit for a beat. The Accord of 1792 gives Gringotts full legal right to take wardship of any magical minor found in circumstances of abandonment. That's what happened. That's what the records show. And the inheritance record, Skeeter said, writing quickly. The siphon notation. Is in the ledger, Harry said. Treaty protected, publicly accessible to any witch or wizard who submits a formal records request. I'd encourage people to look at it. Mr. Potter, Skeeter said, and her voice had shifted, the journalistic calculation was still there but something else had come in underneath it, something that might have been, in a person with a conscience that ran deeper than professional instinct, close to uncomfortable. The name in that record, is in the record, Harry said again. I'm not going to say it for your notepad and give the story a sensation it doesn't need to be sensational. The facts are sensational enough. An infant was siphoned of his magic, abandoned in the cold, and has spent 10 years being raised by goblins because the alternative was being returned to the person who had attached a magical feeding tube to his core. He paused. Those are the facts. Print the facts. Skeeter looked at him for a long moment. She had, Harry thought, a complicated interior life, a person who had spent a career choosing the readable story over the accurate one, and who was currently in a room with a story that was both. It seemed to be creating a kind of internal weather that she wasn't entirely sure what to do with. Your guardian, she said, glancing at Griphook, who was standing a precise distance away, close enough to intervene if necessary, far enough to make clear this was Harry's conversation. Griphook of Ironmaw clan, yes. What do you want people to know about him? Harry thought about the night he was found, which he knew in detail from the vault records, which he had read at 7 in Griphook's own words written in the dry clinical language of a Gringotts report, and what it had cost him to walk out of that cold night carrying something that changed everything. He thought about the puzzle and the first word in gobbledygook and the council sessions and the blade with the rune on its handle and 10 years of again, slower, watch what you're doing when you do it. He found me when no one else was looking, Harry said. Everything else followed from that. Skeeter wrote that down. They left the bank at 11:30 into the full brightness of Diagon Alley in late July, and Harry's first experience of the wizarding world outside of Gringotts was immediate and dense and slightly overwhelming in the specific way of a place that has been described to you in detail and that still manages, when you arrive in it, to be different from the description. The alley was busy, summer peak, families doing Hogwarts shopping, the particular loud variety of humanity that congregated in shopping districts on warm days. Several people glanced at Harry with the casual non-attention of strangers in a crowd and then glanced back with the sharp second look of people whose brains had flagged something before their conscious minds caught up. The scar. The eyes. The face that matched, in outline, a photograph that had been on the front page of the Prophet in 1981. A woman stopped dead in the middle of the alley. Is that, she started. Harry kept walking. He did not stop. He did not perform recognition or discomfort or the sheepishness that the wizarding world would have liked from its famous orphan. He walked through Diagon Alley the way he walked through anything, present, direct, with the particular quality of attention that meant he was seeing everything and registering it all and filing it for later, a habit so deeply ingrained by now that he didn't think of it as a habit at all. "They're staring," said Griphook, quiet, beside him. "I know," Harry said. "Let them." They stopped at Flourish and Blots for the Hogwarts book list. Harry had received the letter that morning at the mountain halls, delivered by an owl so determined to complete its mission that it had apparently circled the magical concealment wards for 40 minutes before finding the gap that the wards were obligated by treaty to leave for official correspondence. The letter was standard, warm, signed by Professor McGonagall, with Dumbledore's name at the top as headmaster. Harry had read it, put it down, and told Griphook the timing was perfect. Griphook had said he knew. In the bookshop, while Harry moved through the aisles with his list, something happened that was not in any plan. A girl was attempting, with increasing frustration, to reach a copy of the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1 on a shelf that was about 6 inches above her maximum reach, even on tiptoe. She was his age, roughly, brown hair, brown eyes, the expression of someone who found the shelf's height a personal affront. She had already tried twice, Harry saw, because there were finger marks on the dust below the book where she'd grazed it and missed. He reached up, took the book off the shelf, and handed it to her. She looked at the book, then at him. Her eyes went to the scar with the speed of someone whose brain had already been doing arithmetic about his face since the moment he walked in. Then back to his face, and her expression did something interesting, cycled through recognition and social calculation and landed, with a definitiveness that was entirely characteristic, on none of that matters, what matters is the thing directly in front of me. "Thank you," she said. "I had it." "You almost had it," Harry said. A pause. "Hermione Granger," she said, the way she'd probably been told to introduce herself since she was 3, the full name, correctly pronounced, offered without apology. "Harry Potter," he said. She already knew that. Of course she already knew that, she'd done the arithmetic, but hearing him say it plainly, without the performance of modesty or the setup for a dramatic reveal, seemed to recalibrate something in her. She looked at him properly, the way she would look at a book that had turned out to be considerably more interesting than its cover suggested. "You're in the Prophet this morning," she said. "I will be tomorrow morning," Harry said. "The story hasn't run yet." "Ah," she said, and processed this, and then made the rapid, confident connection that was so clearly just how her mind worked. "The Gringotts' inheritance ritual. You made it public." "That's why," she stopped herself with the expression of someone who had just remembered they were talking to a stranger in a bookshop and not completing an internal monologue. "That's why," Harry agreed. She looked at him for another moment. "I'm Muggle-born," she said, and the information was offered with the particular quality of someone who had learned that this fact produced reactions in people and who had long since decided that people's reactions were their own problem. "My mother was Muggle-born," Harry said. Hermione Granger's expression did the thing again, the rapid internal recalibration. "I know," she said. "I read notable magical families before I came. And the history of magical Britain, and the Hogwarts, a history. Do you know there are 17 versions of that book? The most recent one leaves out the 1782 Goblin Treaty entirely, which seems deliberate," Harry said. She stopped. Looked at him. Something shifted in her face that was less like meeting a stranger and more like the recognition of a specific, familiar wavelength. "Yes," she said. "Exactly." They moved through the rest of the book list in approximate parallel, comparing titles, and by the time they reached the counter Harry had learned that Hermione Granger was the only child of 2 Muggle dentists from Hampstead, had been reading about the wizarding world since she received her letter in January, was deeply concerned about the inconsistencies in how magical history was taught and documented, and had, without apparently finding this remarkable, already memorized the table of contents of 4 of the 6 required textbooks. He had also learned, without her saying it directly, that she didn't have friends yet in the wizarding world, and that she had handled this with the same approach she applied to everything, by reading about it rather than feeling badly. At the door, she stopped. "Hogwarts," she said, as statement, not question. "September 1st, Harry said. "I'll see you on the train," she said, and walked away into Diagon Alley with her books under her arm and the straight-backed bearing of someone who had decided the world was going to be interesting and had allocated her energy accordingly. Grip Hook, who had observed the entire exchange from the corner with the expressionless quality that meant he was feeling something he had not expected to feel, said nothing until they were back in the alley. "Muggle-born," he said finally. "Sharp as a blade," Harry said. "You heard her on the history books." "I did," Grip Hook said. A brief pause. "Your mother would have liked her." Harry said nothing for a moment. Then, "Yes. I think so too." They were halfway back to the Gringotts service entrance when Grip Hook's pace shifted, a micro-adjustment, barely visible, the kind of movement a trained fighter made when their senses flagged something before their mind had fully processed what. Harry felt it and adjusted his own pace in response, the way 10 years of training had made his body immediately fluent in Grip Hook's signals. 2 o'clock, Grip Hook said, very quietly. Harry didn't turn. He read the angle of Grip Hook's gaze in his peripheral vision and located the source through the reflection in a shop window as they passed it. An old man, white-haired and white-bearded, half-moon spectacles, robes of a deep plum color, standing at the far end of the alley outside what appeared to be a sweet shop. He was not looking in their direction, he was talking to a small group of witches and wizards with the easy authority of someone who was always the most important person in any space he occupied. His posture was that of a man entirely at home. But one of his companions, a younger man, dark, with the watchful eyes of someone whose attention was professionally trained, had glanced toward Harry. And then the old man had glanced toward Harry. Just briefly. The half-moon spectacles catching the summer light. He didn't recognize him. Harry could see that clearly enough, the glance held no spark of specific recognition, just the same reflexive second look that everyone was giving him today. The old man had not yet seen the prophet story. He had not yet been told. He didn't know that the child he believed dead or irretrievably lost was standing 30 feet away in the summer sunshine with his mother's green eyes and a goblin-forged blade at his hip. But he would know, Harry thought. By tomorrow morning, he would know. The old man turned back to his conversation. Harry kept walking. He did not alter his pace or his expression or the quality of his presence, which was, as it always was, completely unhurried and completely unafraid. He reached the Gringotts service entrance. He went through the door. He walked back into the amber warmth of his bank and his world and the institution that had, on the first day of November 1981, given him the only thing that actually mattered. Someone who was looking for him. That afternoon, in Grip Hook's London office, a room that was smaller than the Mountain Hall offices and had the particular quality of a space used for serious work rather than comfort, they sat with the certified inheritance record and the box of his mother's research notes and the photograph album, and Harry opened the album for the first time. His parents looked back at him from a moving photograph taken on a summer day somewhere green, both of them young, younger than Harry could quite process, his father with the same uncorrectable hair and his mother with those eyes, and both of them laughing at something that had happened just before the picture was taken and whose aftermath was still on their faces. His father reached over and put his arm around his mother's shoulders and she leaned into it, and then she looked at the camera and her expression, mid-laugh, mid-lean, entirely present in the moment, was a face Harry had looked at in the mirror every day for 11 years. He didn't say anything. He looked at the photograph for a long time and then he closed the album and put it on the desk with care and opened the box of research notes instead. He was not going to perform grief in an office. He would carry the photograph in his head, the way he'd been carrying the image of them for years, as something that belonged to him and to no one else, as something that was his, not the story, not the legend, not the boy who lived, just his mother laughing in a green field. The research notes were dense and brilliant. Even in the first 20 minutes, skimming through Lily Potter's cramped, quick handwriting, Harry could see the shape of what she had been working toward, the magical mechanics of a love-based protection, sacrificial magic so rare and so specific that most of the wizarding world considered it theoretical. She had been building toward something. An understanding. A design. She had not, Harry thought, been preparing for the worst. She had been preparing for the specific. She knew he was coming, Harry said. Griphook looked up from his own paperwork. Voldemort. She knew he was coming specifically for us. Not just generally, she knew the date or close to it. She had time to prepare the magic, which means she had warning. Harry turned a page. Where did the warning come from? A beat of silence. That, Griphook said carefully, is a question whose answer you may find in the restricted vault files. There is a section on the Fidelius charm and its application to Godric's Hollow in 1981. I have left it for you to read when you were ready. Harry looked at him. You know what it says. I do. Tell me. Griphook set down his work. Your parents used a Fidelius charm to hide their location, he said. A charm of that nature requires a secret keeper, someone who holds the secret and without whose disclosure it cannot be found. Your father wanted to be secret keeper himself. He was talked out of it. He was persuaded, by someone he trusted, someone who argued with great conviction that a different arrangement was safer, to use a friend named Peter Pettigrew instead. The room was very quiet. Who talked him out of it? Harry said. Not a question. Griphook met his eyes. He was everywhere, Harry said, and the flatness in his voice was not anger, it was something colder and more comprehensive than anger, the recognition of a pattern so complete it had its own architectural logic. Every decision. Every arrangement. Every trusted advice that shaped what happened to them. He put the research notes down. He didn't kill my parents directly. He didn't need to. He just managed the conditions. Yes, Griphook said. Harry sat with that for a moment. Then he picked up the research notes again. Then understanding exactly what my mother did, the magic she built to protect me, is more important than I already thought. Because if it was strong enough to stop Voldemort, it's important enough that Dumbledore wanted it under his control. He turned another page. And I'm going to understand it completely before I walk into Hogwarts. Outside the window of Gringotts London, Diagon Alley was beginning to quieten as evening came in. Lamps were lighting up and down the cobblestone street, and the last of the day's shoppers were heading home, and somewhere in the city an owl was carrying tomorrow's profit story to its print run, carrying a name and a scar and an inheritance record and a question that had 10 years of careful, irrefutable evidence behind it. In a cottage in Wiltshire, Albus Dumbledore would pick up his morning copy by breakfast. Harry turned another page. He wasn't thinking about Dumbledore's reaction. He was thinking about his mother's handwriting, the way it sped up when she was excited about something, the way certain words were underlined twice when she was certain, and the shape of a magic so deep and so personal that it had no match in any documented text, and the fact that she had built it herself, from first principles, in the months before she died. She had been extraordinary. He had known this. Now he was reading it, line by line, in her own hand. He read until the lamp needed turning up and Griphook, without comment, reached across and turned it up, and they sat in the warm London office in the quiet of the evening with the documentation of theft on one side of the desk and the evidence of love on the other, and both were, in their own ways, going to matter enormously in the weeks to come. Chapter 4, The Blood Test's Testimony. The Daily Prophet ran the story on a Wednesday. Rita Skeeter had, to her credit and possibly to her own surprise, printed the facts. The headline was not subtle: Boy who lived found alive, 10 years in Gringotts custody, inheritance record reveals shocking magical violation, but the story beneath it was clean and specific and sourced entirely to the treaty-protected ledger record, which meant it was legally unassailable. The certified copy of the inheritance ritual sat in the Gringotts vault. The supplementary forensic report naming the siphon's installer sat in the treaty-protected record. The Accord of 1792 documentation of Harry's wardship was time-stamped November 2, 1981, 31 hours after Voldemort's fall. The Prophet printed all of it. Harry was eating breakfast in Griphook's London office when the owl arrived with the paper, and he read the story the way he read everything, front to back, no skimming, registering each piece of information in its proper sequence. The photograph they'd used was the one Skeeter had taken outside the bank, Harry walking out of the service entrance into the alley, griphook beside him, both of them in motion. Harry looked, in the photograph, exactly like what he was, someone with somewhere to be, moving toward it without hesitation. He set the paper down. "She kept the quick quotes quill in her pocket the whole time," he said. Griphook looked up from his own copy. "You knew?" "I could hear it scratching." He picked up his tea. "I let her keep it because what it would have written was probably close enough to what she actually wrote that it didn't matter. And because people who feel they've gotten away with something are easier to work with than people who feel they've been caught." He paused. "She'll be useful again." Griphook considered this. "You're 11, he said. "You started bringing me to council sessions at 9, Harry pointed out. A pause. "Fair," said Griphook, and went back to his paper. The Wizarding World's reaction was not immediate. It was the specific kind of delay that happened when information arrived that was simultaneously irrefutable and catastrophic, when the gap between what people had believed and what was now documented in a treaty-protected ledger was wide enough that the mind needed time to cross it. For the first several hours, the Prophet's news owls reported mostly silence, a quality of collective breath-holding, the pause before the wave. By afternoon, the wave arrived. Howlers went to the ministry. The Wizengamot received 11 emergency session requests before noon. 3 members of the International Confederation of Wizards sent formal communications to Gringotts requesting clarification of the treaty-protected record, which under the terms of the accord Gringotts was obligated to provide, which meant 3 more certified copies of the inheritance record were dispatched before sundown. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement, which had the specific distinction of being one of the institutions most thoroughly shaped by Dumbledore's influence over the past 40 years, issued a statement that was 6 paragraphs of nothing, not a denial, not a confirmation, not anything that could be quoted or held to, which was itself a kind of answer. And Albus Dumbledore issued no statement at all. Harry read the no-statement story, buried on page 6 of the evening edition, headlined "Hogwarts Headmaster Declines to Comment," and felt the shape of it with the same instinct that read rune sequences, that read council chamber dynamics, that had read Skeeter's pocket quill. Dumbledore was not silent because he had nothing to say. He was silent because every possible response was worse than silence. Denial required him to challenge the treaty-protected record directly, which would take the matter to the Goblin High Court, which was exactly where Harry wanted it. Confirmation required him to explain himself, which he was not, under any existing legal framework, required to do yet, but which, said aloud, would destroy 40 years of carefully built trust in the space of a sentence. He was waiting. He was thinking. He was, Harry suspected, moving pieces. Good, Harry thought. Moving pieces meant leaving traces. He spent the week before September 1st in Griphook's London office and in the Gringotts archive, finishing his mother's research notes. The notes were extraordinary, 3 years of work by someone who had identified, from first principles, a form of magic so rare it had no formal name in any text she'd been able to find, and had constructed its theoretical framework herself. The protection she'd built over Godric's Hollow was deliberate and architectural, and the sacrifice at its core was not accidental. It was a choice, made with full understanding, and the protection it generated was tied to a specific mechanic, love as active magical force, not metaphor, not sentiment, but quantifiable and transferable and deeply, permanently binding. Harry was not a sentimental person, in the way that the Wizarding World would have expected the boy who lived to be sentimental about his mother. He didn't cry over the notes. He read them with the focused intensity he brought to everything, and he felt, somewhere below the strategic and the analytical, a quality of recognition that had nothing to do with memory, since he had no memory of her, and everything to do with understanding that a person who thought like this had made him, and had died making sure he would survive, and had done it with the same deliberate, structural intelligence that ran through every page. By the time he finished the notes he had a complete theoretical model of the magic in question. He had also identified 3 implications that his mother had been in the process of pursuing and had not, because of what happened in October 1981, been able to complete. He wrote them up in a research document, using Ironvale's notation standards, and added them to the box. He would finish them himself. September 1st arrived with the quality of a gear engaging, something large beginning to move. The platform was loud. This was Harry's primary, immediate impression, the volume of 900 years of tradition compacted into a train station, families crowded along the barrier, owls going mad in their cages, steam rising from the Hogwarts Express in great white curtains that smelled of coal and the specific magical warmth of an engine that ran on something considerably more interesting than combustion. Harry moved through it with the same quality he'd moved through Diagon Alley, present, direct, reading everything, and got his trunk loaded and found a compartment toward the rear of the train, which was the less crowded end, which suited him. Hermione Granger arrived in the compartment doorway approximately 4 minutes later, as if she'd done a systematic sweep of the train and reached him through process of elimination. "You're in the back of the train," she said. "Less crowded," he said. She put her trunk in the rack with efficient motions. "I read the Prophet's story," she said, sitting down. 3 times. Then I read the treaty-protected record summary that Gringotts published on the supplementary report. Then I read the 1792 Accord itself, which is available in the British Library's restricted collection if you submit a formal request, which took 4 days to process but was worth it. She looked at him steadily. The forensic methodology the Gringotts Inheritance Chamber used for the siphon analysis is based on the same bloodcraft principles your guardian practices. It's technically not recognized by British wizarding law as an evidentiary standard. "Correct," Harry said. "But it's in the treaty-protected record, which sits outside British wizarding law's jurisdiction and can only be challenged in the Goblin High Court." She paused. "Which means if Dumbledore wants to dispute it, he has to do it in a forum where British wizarding law has no authority and the evidentiary standards are entirely Goblin set." "Also correct," Harry said. "That's why you did it that way." "That's why Griphook did it that way," Harry said, which was accurate. The forum choice had been Griphook's design from the beginning, built on 30 years of treaty expertise. "I just showed up and bled on a basin." Hermione looked like she wanted to argue with the modesty of this characterization and also like she recognized it wasn't entirely inaccurate. She settled for, "What do you think he'll do?" "I think he'll do what powerful people always do when the rules don't work for them," Harry said. "He'll try to change the conversation." She considered this. "Hogwarts," she said. "He controls the environment at Hogwarts. If you're in his school, then he has proximity, structured authority, and the institutional weight of 1,000 years of tradition on his side," Harry finished. "Yes. So why are you going?" He looked at her. "Because the platform he needs is also the platform I need," he said. "I'm not hiding from him. I'm not afraid of him. And every day I exist, visibly, in his school, doing what I do, that's another day the story in the ledger has to stand on its own without him being able to reframe it." He paused. "And honestly, I want to learn magic properly. The theoretical foundation is there. I want the application." Hermione was quiet for a moment. Then, with the expression of someone who has run a calculation and arrived at an answer that pleases them, "I think we're going to be friends." "I think you decided that in Flourish and Blots," Harry said. "I decided it when you said deliberate about the history textbook," she corrected. Flourish and Blots was confirmation. The train moved. England rolled past the windows in late summer green, fields and hedgerows and small towns and the slow broadening of the countryside as London fell away. Other students knocked on the compartment door during the journey and Harry let most of them pass. A red-haired boy named Ron Weasley stopped briefly, looked at Harry with the specific expression of someone reconciling the face with the legend, and seemed to get stuck between several conversational approaches. He left in a mild state of confusion. A pale blonde boy arrived with 2 large companions and the manner of someone who had practiced his entrance, looked at Harry with the calculation of someone who had been briefed on his social significance and was attempting to establish early terms, and said his name was Draco Malfoy and extended his hand. Harry looked at the hand. Looked at Malfoy. "I know who you are," he said, not unkindly but with a quality of directness that made the handshake unnecessary without refusing it. "Sit down if you want. The compartment's not full." Malfoy sat. His companions, Crabbe and Goyle, large, quiet, functioning primarily as furniture, took up the remaining seats. Malfoy studied Harry for a moment with the particular expression of someone recalibrating a prepared approach. He had very good instincts, Harry thought, not deep, but sharp on the surface, the kind of instincts that a person developed when they grew up in a house where reading the room meant survival. The story in The Prophet, Malfoy said, abandoning the prepared approach entirely and going straight to what he actually wanted to know. My father says it's a Gringotts political play. Your father is right that it's political, Harry said. He's wrong that it's a play. The ledger record is the ledger record. It doesn't have an agenda. Malfoy was quiet for a moment, processing. Dumbledore is, he stopped. Politically significant, Hermione supplied, and Malfoy looked at her with the slightly startled expression of someone who hadn't expected a contribution from that direction. He's the most trusted figure in the wizarding world, Malfoy said. He was, Harry said. Malfoy looked at him. There was a complicated interior weather in that look. The Malfoy family position was constructed entirely around correct alignment with power, and power was currently shifting in ways that would require very careful reading. Harry watched him work through it and thought that Draco Malfoy was not a villain, not in any fundamental sense. He was a boy who had been taught, very thoroughly, that power was the only thing worth orienting toward, and who was currently discovering that he'd been taught which power to orient toward without being taught how to think about power itself. What do you want? Malfoy asked. Blunt, for him. What's yours is yours, Harry said. What was taken from others should be returned. And anyone who thinks that the rules are for other people should have to learn otherwise in the most public forum available. He paused. That's what I want. Not that complicated. Malfoy sat with that for the rest of the journey without saying much more, and when the train arrived and they filed out onto the Hogsmeade platform into the cool Scottish night, he gave Harry one more look, unreadable, complicated, the look of someone who hadn't finished their calculation, and walked away toward the carriages without the companions, which was itself a statement of some kind. Hagrid was waiting at the platform calling for first years, and Harry took one look at the enormous man, rubicund, warm, enthusiastic in the manner of someone whose feelings were always one size too big for the space available, and felt an immediate, instinctive liking that had nothing to do with strategic assessment. Hagrid looked at Harry with tears building in his eyes before he'd finished saying his name, which was a response that Harry didn't quite know what to do with, but which he suspected was genuine in a way that many responses to his existence were not. Yeah, look just like your father, Hagrid said, enormous voice lowered to something approximating private. But Yevi got your mother's eyes. I know, Harry said. He meant it differently than Hagrid would understand it, loaded with his mother's research notes and her handwriting and her photograph in a summer field, but it was true both ways. I've been told. The boats across the lake were calm in the September dark, the castle rising out of the black water with the specific combination of age and magic and structural ambition that characterized a building that had been growing and changing for 1,000 years and had no intention of stopping. Harry sat in the boat and looked at it and felt, not the intimidation that many of the students around him were clearly feeling, not the awe, but something more practical and more personal. This was the platform. This was where the next stage of things happened. He was here. The ceiling of the Great Hall was doing the stars when they filed in, which Harry knew about from Hogwarts, a history but which was, in person, considerably more immersive than any description had managed to convey. The 4 house tables stretched the length of the hall, every face turning as the first years walked in, and Harry moved through the collective attention of 800 students and every teacher at the staff table with the same quality of unhurried directness that he brought to everything, not performing indifference and not performing confidence, just, present. He did not, in the 30 seconds between walking into the hall and reaching the sorting hat's stool, look at the staff table. He didn't need to verify the reaction happening there. He could feel it. The hat was placed on his head. Well, said a voice in his head, dry and ancient and genuinely surprised, which he hadn't expected. He'd expected authority, performance, the gravity of a 1,000-year-old artifact doing its function. Instead it sounded like someone who had been doing their job for a very long time and had just encountered something that made the job briefly interesting again. Now there's a head I haven't been inside in quite a while. The last time I saw a magical core like this, you've never seen a magical core like this, Harry thought back, not aggressively, just accurately. A pause. Then what felt like a laugh. No. I haven't. Let's see what you've got, shall we? He felt it move through his mind the way the council chamber sessions had taught him things moved, not invasively, but thoroughly, reading the shape of what was there. The warcraft and the runes and the bloodcraft and the political architecture. The deep vault warmth and the mountain halls and the amber lights. Griphook's hands adjusting the practice stylus angle. Ragnarok's bronze eyes. Coppervane's raft and the drainage tunnels. His mother's quick handwriting speeding up when she was excited. The photograph. The ledger. The plan. You could go anywhere, the hat said, and it wasn't a compliment, it was an observation, the tone of a surveyor assessing terrain. Slytherin would appreciate the strategy. Ravenclaw would appreciate the mind. Hufflepuff would appreciate, actually, you're more Hufflepuff than anyone in this hall will understand for a considerable time, given what loyalty actually costs you. And Gryffindor? Harry thought. Gryffindor is where you put people who run toward the thing everyone else is running away from, the hat said. Even when they're the only one running. A beat. Harry thought about a November night, a frost-covered street, a war chief who had walked out of the cold darkness carrying something that changed everything. Gryffindor, he thought. Gryffindor. The hat announced. The table erupted. Harry took the hat off, handed it back to Professor McGonagall, who was looking at him with an expression that was trying very hard to be professionally neutral and not quite achieving it, and walked to the Gryffindor table and sat down. The applause was enormous and had a quality of overwhelm to it, the release of 10 years of wondering where he was and what had happened and what it meant, all of it coming out through clapping hands in a stone hall under a ceiling full of stars. Harry sat through it without performing modesty or embarrassment. He gave it its moment and then it settled and the sorting continued, and Hermione Granger joined him at the Gryffindor table 20 minutes later with a bright expression of controlled satisfaction, and the feast appeared, and Harry, who had spent his life eating goblin food and developing a genuine appreciation for spiced mushroom broth and seasoned root preparations and the specific hearty cuisine of people who lived underground, loaded his plate with everything and ate with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of someone who was neither performing appetite nor suppressing it. He still hadn't looked at the staff table. He looked now. Dumbledore sat at the center of the high table in robes of deep burgundy, long-fingered hands folded in front of him, the half-moon spectacles sitting on his nose above a white beard that was magnificent in the way that all things were magnificent that had been maintained and presented with sufficient care over a sufficient number of years. He was looking at Harry with an expression that was, composed. That was the word. Not blank, not shocked, not guilty. Composed. The expression of a chess player who has just found the piece they thought was taken back on the board. Harry met his eyes. He held the eye contact for 2 full seconds, long enough for it to be deliberate, short enough not to be a confrontation, and then turned back to his plate and ate another serving of roast potatoes. Hermione, who had been watching this exchange sidelong, leaned slightly closer. He recognized you, she said, very quietly. Of course he did, Harry said. He's been waiting for this for 10 years. What did you see in his face? Harry thought about it. Someone doing arithmetic, he said. Figuring out how much I know. Figuring out what I'll do with it. Figuring out whether the pieces are where he left them or whether someone's been moving them while he wasn't watching. He paused. They haven't been where he left them for quite some time. The first week of classes was educational, in ways that went beyond curriculum. Harry was good at magic. This was not something he had to discover at Hogwarts. He had been good at magic since Thornwick had described his developmental trajectory at 14 months old, since the carved puzzle had reassembled itself at 2, since Iron Veil had started giving him the higher-order rune sequences at 8 and he'd done them correctly on the 3rd attempt rather than the expected 10th. He was good at magic the way some people were good at seeing spatial relationships or hearing musical structure. It was native, fundamental, operating at a level below conscious technique. What Hogwarts offered, that he hadn't had before, was the systematic application of a wand. The wand was unexpected. Not the magic it produced, which he already understood in considerable theoretical depth, but the feeling of it, the way it altered the relationship between intention and output. He'd done wandless magic all his life, raw direct magical output that went from his core to the world with the friction of willpower and nothing else. The wand was a translator. It smoothed and shaped and focused, and the result was different, more precise, more varied, more controlled in ways that wandless work couldn't achieve without significant additional effort. He had purchased his wand in Ollivanders, holly and phoenix feather, 11 inches, which had vibrated with the specific resonance of recognition when he'd held it, and which Ollivander had stared at for a long moment before saying, in a voice that was mostly to himself, "Curious, very curious," and he spent the first week of classes developing the language of it the way he developed all languages, systematically, quickly, with particular attention to the structural mechanics rather than just the output. By the end of the first week, in Charms, Professor Flitwick had made him demonstrate Wingardium Leviosa 3 times in succession because the first time had been technically perfect and he hadn't been sure he'd seen what he thought he'd seen. By the third time, Flitwick had gone slightly pink around the ears and written something in his register that Harry, from across the room, was reasonably confident was a note to McGonagall. Transfiguration was McGonagall's domain, and McGonagall was, Harry had read her record, knew her career, had formed opinions in advance, formidable in the way that the best teachers were formidable, the way Ironvale was formidable. High standards and absolute consistency, no quarter given for charm or celebrity, the quality of someone who taught because they believed in what they were teaching and had no patience for it being done badly. She had been in Dumbledore's orbit for 30 years. She was brilliant, principled, and loyal. She was also, Harry suspected, not entirely comfortable with what she'd read in the Prophet last Wednesday. She didn't mention it. She taught Transfiguration. On the third day, she gave a practical assessment, match into needle, standard first year, and Harry did it in the first attempt and added 2 additional transformations without being asked, cycling the needle back through match and into a small silver rune pin with an iron maw pattern on the head that he had designed himself in about 6 seconds. McGonagall looked at the rune pin for a very long moment. "Mr. Potter," she said, in the tone of someone choosing their words with surgical care. "That last transformation was not in the curriculum." "No," Harry agreed. "It was, however," she said, still looking at the pin, "extraordinarily well executed." She picked it up. "The rune is functional." "Yes. It's a low-level ward seal. Decorative, mostly." She set the pin down with the same careful energy that Thornwick and Griphook both used when they put things down that they found significant. "Stay after class," she said. He stayed. She sat across from him at the teaching desk with her hands folded and looked at him with the directness of someone who had decided to skip several conversational stages. "I read the Prophet story," she said. "Most people did," Harry said. "I have been teaching at Hogwarts for 31 years, McGonagall said. "I have been head of Gryffindor House for 26. "I have known Albus Dumbledore for," she stopped. Something moved through her face. "I need you to understand that what I am about to say comes from a position of genuine conflict. I am not going to pretend otherwise." She looked at him steadily. "The record in the ledger. The forensic analysis. You believe it is accurate." "I know it is accurate," Harry said. "Not aggressive. Not defensive. The tone of someone reporting a measurement." "The Goblin High Court," she said. "Gringotts has formally lodged the treaty-protected record as the basis for a preliminary inquiry. The inquiry will begin, when—" Harry blinked. This was new information. "I wasn't told it had been formally lodged." "This morning," McGonagall said. "Ragnarok himself filed the formal request. The inquiry begins in October." She paused. The inquiry is going to require testimony from Gringotts representatives. Potentially from the heir claimant himself. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has been very competent and very loyal for a very long time and has just found a crack in the foundation she built her life on. Potentially from Hogwarts staff. The room was quiet. "Professor," Harry said, "are you asking me whether I need you to testify?" "I'm asking," she said precisely, "what you know." "All of it. Because if I am going to be called to testify, I intend to know exactly what I am testifying to and not be surprised by anything in that chamber." She paused. "I was on Privet Drive the night you were left there." Harry went still. "I spent the day there," McGonagall said, and her voice had the tight quality of something long held. "In my animagus form. I had reservations. About the Dursleys, about the neighborhood, about," she stopped. "I watched children in those streets and I thought," she stopped again. "I raised my concerns. I was told they were unfounded. That the blood wards were sufficient. That the greater good required a specific set of circumstances that I did not fully understand but should trust." Her hands, still folded on the desk, tightened slightly. "I left. And the next morning you were gone, and Albus told me you were with your family and that was where you needed to be. And when the siphon story broke last week," Harry said quietly. "And when the siphon story broke last week," she said, "I remembered the day I had spent watching Privet Drive, and I thought about what you would have been like if you had stayed, and I thought about the blood wards and what they required to function, and I thought about the logic of it. The way everything about it was arranged." "He's been doing it for 40 years, Harry said. "Other children. The records are in Gringotts' restricted vault. I can have certified copies sent to you." McGonagall looked at the desk. Her expression was not grief, it was harder than grief, more structural. The look of someone dismantling something load-bearing and knowing exactly what the collapse is going to sound like. "Send them," she said. He sent them that evening, via Gringotts' internal owl. The second week of school moved with the pace of multiple things developing in parallel. The preliminary inquiry news spread, the Prophet ran it on page 2 with a subdued headline that was itself a reflection of the shifting ground, the slightly cautious quality of an institution that had spent decades treating Dumbledore as immovable and was recalibrating its own language in real time. 3 Wisengamot members issued public statements. One retired Auror, a woman named Moody who had, by all accounts, spent her career fighting the darkness that Dumbledore claimed to oppose, sent a letter directly to Gringotts expressing her willingness to provide testimony. And in potions, on a Thursday morning, Harry met Severus Snape. Snape entered the dungeon classroom the way he entered all spaces, dramatically, with a quality of controlled darkness that Harry recognized as a cultivated professional effect rather than natural temperament, the effect of someone who had decided a long time ago that being feared was more comfortable than being known. He moved through the class with the smooth assurance of complete authority and stopped at the front and turned around, and Harry watched him locate his face in the room with the speed of someone who'd been expecting to find it. Snape looked at him for one long moment. His face was difficult to read, not because he was hiding nothing but because he was hiding an enormous amount with considerable skill, and the skill itself was the information. He was a deeply experienced occlumens. Harry, who had studied bloodcraft and spent years reading magical signatures, could sense the closed-off quality of him from across the room, a mind so thoroughly sealed that even the leakage, the ambient magical texture of a person's emotional state, was almost entirely suppressed. Almost. "Potter," Snape said, and then stopped. Whatever he had been prepared to say, and Harry could see that he had been prepared to say something, had perhaps been preparing it since Wednesday morning, since the Prophet story, since some internal reckoning that had been happening behind those sealed doors, had changed somewhere between his entry and this moment. "Sir," Harry said. Snape's eyes moved to his forehead, the specific reflexive movement of everyone who met him for the first time and knew about the scar, and then moved away with the deliberate speed of someone choosing not to react. He turned to the front of the class. "Potions," he said, beginning his opening address, "is not the same as your foolish wand-waving. Potions is precision. Potions is chemistry and patience and the understanding that some processes cannot be rushed, that some reactions are inevitable once certain elements are combined, and that the only question is whether the person combining them knows what they're doing. He moved along the front of the room, slow. Open your books. Page 14. The Boil Cure Potion. This is beneath most of you intellectually and I expect it done correctly regardless. Harry opened his book. He began to work. The potion was, as Snape had said, technically uncomplicated. The intellectual interest was in the chemical sequencing and the magical activation rather than the ingredient complexity, and Harry worked through it with the systematic approach he brought to rune sequences, methodical and unhurried, watching each stage before proceeding to the next. Snape circled the room with the quality of someone waiting to find fault and finding it in abundance. He reached Harry's station and stopped. Harry was halfway through the third stage. The potion was the exact right color, the deep green of the textbook illustration, not the slightly off blue-green that most of the class was producing, which indicated improper porcupine quill timing. Snape looked at the cauldron. Looked at Harry. "Where did you learn to prepare porcupine quills?" he said, very quietly, the tone of someone keeping a larger question compressed into a smaller one. "The Gringotts vault records include potions documentation going back 4 centuries, Harry said, equally quiet. "I read the original preparation methodology before I read the simplified textbook version. The simplified version leaves out a step." A pause. Something moved in Snape's face, very controlled, very brief, the micro-expression of a man who had expected to find one thing and found another. "Which step?" he said. "The cooling interval before adding the quills. The heat affects the barb structure. 30 seconds at reduced heat first." Harry met his eyes. "It's in the 1743 Gringotts Preparation Index. Page 47. Snape said nothing for a moment. Then he moved on without comment, which from Snape, Harry was beginning to understand, was its own form of acknowledgement. After class, as the students filed out, Harry stayed. He stayed not because he'd been asked to but because Snape had, in the last 10 minutes of the lesson, been looking at him with an expression that had the quality of something accumulating, something that was going to need to come out eventually and that Harry preferred to address directly rather than let build. Snape stood at his desk with his back to the room, putting away his demonstration materials. "You were my mother's friend," Harry said. The hands on the desk went still. "The restricted vault records include social documentation from the years before 1981, Harry said. Hogwarts records, in part, academic transcripts, extracurricular documentation, some personal correspondence that the estate solicitors archived. You and Lily Evans were in the same year. You were close, for a significant period." Snape turned around. His face was, not blank. Not the Accluman's closed expression. Something had come through the seal, something old enough and sharp enough to cut through the professional effect. He looked at Harry with the specific quality of someone who has been carrying something for 10 years and has just had it named in a room without warning. "Yes," he said. One word, flat and certain. "You know things about that year," Harry said. "The year before they died. You were, somewhere in the apparatus. I don't know where yet. The vault records don't have everything." He paused. "But you know things that would be relevant to the Goblin High Court inquiry. And I think you've known since Wednesday morning that you were going to have to decide what to do with them." Snape's jaw was very tight. The thing behind his eyes was not guilt, exactly, it was more structural than guilt, more like someone standing at the site of a decision made long ago and seeing it clearly for the first time. "What is it you want from me, Potter?" he said, and his voice had lost the dungeon drawl, the cultivated darkness, it was just a voice now, tightly controlled but not performing anything. "Nothing yet," Harry said. "I wanted you to know that I know you exist in this story. And that when the inquiry gets to the part of the story that involves you, I'd rather have a conversation in advance than have you be surprised in that chamber." He paused. "My mother chose her friends carefully. I think she was good at it." Snape looked at him for a long moment. The expression was complicated in a way that Harry thought probably had a decade's worth of layers to it, grief and guilt and the specific, terrible tenderness of someone who loved a person who died before everything between them was resolved. She was, Snape said. Very quietly. She was extraordinary at it. Harry nodded and picked up his bag and left the dungeon. Outside in the corridor, Hermione was waiting, which meant she had timed her departure from the class to give him whatever time he needed and then positioned herself to walk with him to the next lesson, which was, she would probably never admit it was protective and he would never point it out. Snape, she said. Complicated, Harry said. But not against us. He thought about it. He might actually be the most important piece. Why? Because Dumbledore trusts him completely, Harry said, and he trusted Dumbledore completely, and that trust is currently adjusting. He paused. People who are in the process of understanding they've been used are either destroyed by it or they become very, very motivated. Hermione was quiet for a moment. That's either very insightful or very cold. Both, Harry said, which made her laugh despite herself, and they walked up the stone corridor toward the afternoon's lessons as October came in off the Scottish hills and the first leaves turned on the trees by the lake, and somewhere in London the Goblin High Court was preparing its chambers for an inquiry that was going to change the shape of the wizarding world. The week before the inquiry opened, a second owl arrived. Not from the ministry. Not from any institution. A private owl, small, fast, carrying a letter sealed with plain wax and addressed in a handwriting that Harry did not recognize but that Hermione, looking over his shoulder, identified immediately as the handwriting from the library signature registry. Mr. Potter, it read. You do not know me, but I was a student at Hogwarts in the class of 1972. I was one of Albus Dumbledore's brightest students. I was also, according to a Gringotts diagnostic I requested this week after reading the treaty-protected record, the recipient of a magical siphon that ran from my third year at Hogwarts until I left the country in 1979. I am currently in France. I am available to testify. I suspect I am not the only one. A.P. Harry read it twice. He folded it carefully and put it in the inner pocket of his jacket. How many? Hermione said quietly. Enough, Harry said. He wrote to Griphook that evening. Griphook wrote back by morning. The response was 7 words and a single rune. We are ready. October is ours. Chapter 5, The War Chief's Verdict. October arrived in Scotland with the quality of a drawn blade, cold, clean, and absolutely precise. The Goblin High Court did not sit in London. It sat in the deep mountain complex that most wizarding maps marked as uninhabited highland terrain, in a chamber that had been carved from living rock in the year 843 and had hosted every significant legal proceeding between goblin kind and the wizarding world for 12 centuries. The chamber was not large. It did not need to be. The Goblin High Court derived its authority not from architectural grandeur but from the simple, immovable fact that its jurisdiction was treaty-protected in a document older than the Ministry of Magic, older than Hogwarts, older than most of the institutions that the wizarding world treated as permanent. The inquiry had been scheduled for the 3rd week of October, which gave Griphook 6 weeks from the filing date to build the formal evidentiary structure. He used every one of them. Harry had leave from Hogwarts for the hearing. McGonagall had processed the paperwork personally, with the expression of someone who was managing a very large number of feelings through the medium of bureaucratic precision. She had also, in the 2 weeks since Harry had sent her the restricted vault records, been noticeably quieter in staff meetings. Snape had told him this. Snape had been telling Harry things in a series of brief, controlled conversations after potions that had the structure of a man releasing pressure from a valve, not a confession, not a full accounting, but pieces, offered one at a time, each piece chosen with the care of someone who had decided to tell the truth and was doing it at the pace his nervous system could sustain. He had confirmed the secret keeper arrangement. He had confirmed that Dumbledore had orchestrated the switch from James to Pettigrew, though he had presented it to the Potters as precautionary wisdom rather than strategic management. He had confirmed, with the tight-jawed economy of someone saying a thing they had been not saying for a decade, that he had delivered part of a prophecy to Voldemort himself, a fragment, overheard, reported before he understood what it meant, and that Dumbledore had known this, had used the knowledge of Snape's culpability to bind him to service, to create a loyalty built on guilt rather than choice. "He is very good," Snape said once, looking at his desk, not at Harry, in the particular tone of someone giving a professional assessment of a person they had reason to hate. "At finding the specific thing a person cannot bear and making it the hinge of the arrangement." "What was yours?" Harry asked. A long pause. "Your mother," Snape said. And then, before Harry could respond, he told me that if I served him, if I stayed at Hogwarts, if I remained a reliable source of information about Death Eater movements and Ministry politics, he would protect her memory. Ensure her reputation was preserved. Ensure the story of what she did, the sacrifice, was told correctly and completely. He paused. "I was 21 and she had died 3 weeks prior and he was the most trusted man in the world, and I believed him." Another pause, longer. "It was not until your story became public that I began to understand the specific ways in which her memory had not been told correctly or completely." Harry thought about the research notes in the box. About the marginal annotation in gobbledygook, deliberate. About the way his mother's work had been perfectly positioned to serve Dumbledore's purposes, a sacrificial protection tied to a specific bloodline, generating a magical force tied to one child, one scar, one story that Dumbledore controlled the telling of. She knew he was managing the situation around them, Harry said. Her notes indicate she suspected the intelligence about Voldemort's movements was being curated. She was working on independent protections because she didn't fully trust the arranged ones. Snape looked at him then. The expression was the one Harry had seen the first time, something old and sharp, something that the occlumency couldn't fully contain. "She told me," he said quietly. "In her last letter. That she didn't trust the Fidelius arrangement. That something about Pettigrew felt wrong." He stopped. "I told Dumbledore about the letter." The room was very quiet. "And 4 days later," Harry said. "Yes," said Snape. He sat with that for a moment, the full, terrible shape of it. "Then, you'll testify to this?" "Yes," Snape said. Not willingly, not easily, but with the absolute quality of someone who has finished weighing something and put it down. "I will testify to all of it." The morning of the inquiry Harry dressed in the mountain halls, not school robes but his own clothes, the ones he wore in the clan halls, dark and well-made, with the iron maw blade at his hip and his inheritance ring on his right hand. Griphook looked him over when he came out of his quarters and said nothing, which was the iron maw equivalent of approval. Hermione was there. This was not, strictly speaking, procedurally necessary. She was not a witness, not a party, not formally involved in any way. She was there because she had gotten on a train and followed him to Scotland and had been working in parallel since September, building the secondary research case with the systematic intensity of someone who had discovered what they were for and was doing it at full capacity. She had found 6 more letters. Not just AP from France. 6 letters from 6 different former Hogwarts students across 3 decades, all of them responding to a carefully worded notice she had placed in 3 European magical publications describing the treaty-protected record and inviting contact from anyone who had requested a Gringotts diagnostic since its publication. The diagnostics had, in each case, flagged similar siphon scarring. The signatures varied in age and intensity. The architectural pattern was identical. She had documented all of it in a research brief that was 43 pages, fully cited, cross-referenced to the treaty-protected record, and written with the precision of someone who understood that the document might need to stand alone in a legal chamber without her there to explain it. Harry had read it in one sitting and then looked at her across the table and said, "You know this is extraordinary." "It's thorough," she said. "There's a difference." "There isn't, in this case." He paused. "When this is over and you want to do the formal research write-up, I'll make sure Gringotts gives you full archive access." She had gone slightly pink and then composed herself and said that would be very useful, thank you, and turned back to her notes, and Harry had looked at the side of her face and thought that his mother would have been enormously pleased. The portkey to the High Court complex was a Gringotts institutional anchor, not the rough concrete of the Surrey emergency point but a carved stone platform in the mountain halls, surrounded by the record runes of 150 years of formal proceedings. Griphook activated it with the flat, unhurried manner of someone for whom today was the natural end of a 10-year arc of preparation. Harry stepped onto the platform. Hermione stepped on beside him. Thornwick was already there, formal attire, her ledger under her arm. Broadfong and 2 other Ironmaw guardcraft stood at the edges. The world folded and unfolded. The High Court complex was older than anything Harry had been inside before, which was saying something, because he had grown up in spaces carved by goblins who were building for permanence rather than impression. The walls were cut stone that had been worked so precisely that no mortar was visible, the joints so fine they looked drawn rather than built. The main chamber's ceiling was low and vaulted, and the lights, no amber here, instead something older, a blue-white quality that had no source he could identify, just a general luminosity that came from the stone itself, made every face in the room simultaneously clear and unsparing. The chamber was full. Not just Gringotts representatives and Goblin judiciary. The treaty required that Goblin High Court proceedings involving wizarding parties be open to magical press representation and to formal observation by any International Confederation member who submitted a valid request. Rita Skeeter was in the press gallery, proper notepad out, quick quotes quill conspicuously absent, with the expression of someone who had decided that this story was too important to get wrong. 2 other journalists Harry didn't recognize. For International Confederation observers in formal robes with the flags of their respective nations small on their lapels. McGonagall was there. She was sitting in the witness preparation area with the straight-backed, hands-folded composure of someone who had spent 2 weeks making a decision and was at peace with it. Snape was there. He was sitting alone, apart from McGonagall by about 4 seats, with the particular quality of self-contained stillness that Harry had come to recognize as his version of armored. He caught Harry's eye when he entered and gave a single nod. Harry returned it. The AP. From France was there, a woman in her mid-40s named Apollon Perrot, who had been a Ravenclaw, who had the quiet, collected bearing of someone who had been angry for a very long time and had learned to channel it into something useful. She nodded at Harry when he sat down. He nodded back. And Dumbledore was there. He was seated in the respondent's position, not a dock. The High Court didn't use docks, it used a simple chair placed to face the judiciary bench, which was in its own way more exposing than any dock, in robes of deep blue, hands in his lap, the half-moon spectacles on his nose. He looked, from the outside, exactly as he always looked. Composed. Wise. The most trusted man in the world doing the unremarkable work of sitting in a chair. He looked at Harry when Harry entered. Harry sat down in the heir claimant's position, a chair to the left of the Gringotts advocacy bench, where Griphook and Flintrock were arranging their documentation with the efficiency of 2 people who had prepared this case from every possible angle, and looked back. The arithmetic was still happening behind those spectacles. Harry watched it and thought, he still thinks there's a play. He still thinks there is a sequence of moves that resolves this in his favor. He has been the most powerful player in this game for so long that he cannot fully process a board where the pieces are not where he put them. Harry looked away first. Not in concession. In indifference. The Chief Justice of the Goblin High Court was a woman named Stonecrown who was approximately 200 years old and had the presence of a mountain, not threatening, not aggressive, just completely immovable in all weather and not particularly interested in what you thought about it. She opened the proceedings with the formal gobbledygook invocation, which Harry followed easily and which produced a slightly startled quality in the Wizengamot observer who had assumed it would be translated. It wasn't translated. The High Court conducted in gobbledygook. There was a translation service available, via earpiece, for wizarding parties. The precision of the translation was good. The pace of it meant that wizarding participants were always half a beat behind the original, which was, Harry suspected, not accidental. Griphook presented the case. He presented it the way he did everything, clean and straight, facts first, implications second, and the evidence deployed in the specific sequence that made the structure of what had been done emerge organically from the documents themselves. The sanguine reveal from November 1981. The healer's reports from that first night. The Accord of 1792 wardship documentation. The inheritance ritual record. The supplementary forensic analysis. The siphon architecture, its precision, its calibration, the specific technical features that required not just knowledge but sustained, deliberate management over months. He named Dumbledore's signature in the siphon's architecture 6 times in 45 minutes, each time in a different evidentiary context, each time supported by a different certified document. By the 6th time, the name had lost none of its weight and gained the quality of something that didn't need to be argued, only recorded. He presented the secondary cases, the 6 letters, the diagnostic results, the architectural analysis showing the pattern across 30 years. He presented Thornwick's testimony on the developmental suppression effects, which she gave with the precise, clinical authority of someone who had been building toward this specific moment since November 2, 1981. He presented Lily Potter's research notes. Not all of them, only the relevant sections, but the relevant sections included the margin annotation and the passage about distrust of the intelligence arrangements and the letter that Snape had described, and the Chief Justice read the certified copies with the focused attention of someone reading very fine print in poor light, which was not the impression she gave but was, Harry suspected, the reality. Then Snape testified. He sat in the witness chair with his hands flat on his knees and answered questions with the tightly controlled directness of someone who had decided that the only way through this was straight, and he told the High Court about the overheard prophecy and the report and Dumbledore's use of his guilt to construct a loyalty that served Dumbledore's purposes rather than any stated greater good. He told them about the secret keeper conversation. He told them about the letter and the 4 days. The chamber was very quiet for all of it. The quality of the silence was not shock, exactly, shock implies surprise, and the accumulating evidence had been building a structure that anyone paying attention could feel the shape of. It was the silence of confirmation. Of a shape you have been suspecting resolving into visibility. Dumbledore listened to Snape's testimony with his hands still in his lap and his face still composed, and Harry, watching him, saw the arithmetic shift. The play he had been calculating, whatever it was, the sequence he had been running since September 1, since October 3, since 33 years ago when he had first found a powerful child and understood what was possible, was running out of moves. McGonagall testified next. She described the day on Privet Drive with the precise, unwavering account of someone who has spent 2 weeks reconstructing every detail and checking it against her memory and finding it solid throughout. She described the conversation where her concerns were dismissed. She described the logic of the reassurance she'd been given, the blood wards, the greater good, the trust that she had extended because it was what you did, because he had earned it over decades, because questioning it had felt like ingratitude. Her voice was even throughout. The only indication of what it cost was a quality in her jaw, a very slight tightness, that Harry recognized from Snape and from Griphook and from every person who has ever said a true and painful thing in a room where it needed to be said. At the end of her testimony, she looked directly at Dumbledore across the chamber. Not with anger, the anger, if it was there, had been transmuted into something more durable. "I am sorry," she said, "that I did not ask harder questions earlier." She was not talking to the court. Dumbledore looked at her. His expression, for the first time since the proceedings began, showed something that was not composure, something that was, perhaps, the specific grief of a man who sees the full cost of his choices in the face of someone who trusted him completely and is now sitting in a witness chair in a goblin court. It was brief. Then it was gone. The respondent's opportunity came after lunch. Dumbledore stood up, not dramatic, not theatrical, with the simple natural authority of a man who had been the most significant presence in every room he'd entered for 40 years, and he spoke. He did not deny the siphon. Harry had known he wouldn't, the treaty-protected record made denial a legal impossibility, and Dumbledore was too intelligent to attempt something that would collapse immediately and spend whatever credibility he had left. He did not deny the secret keeper arrangement. He did not deny the management of the prophecy intelligence. What he did was explain. He explained with the fluency and conviction of someone who had been explaining it to himself for so long that the explanation had become indistinguishable from belief. The wizarding world in 1980 had been at war. Voldemort was not merely a dark wizard, he was a force of organized destruction with followers in every institution, including this one. A child of Harry's power, left to develop without guidance, without direction, without careful management, would have been found and turned by the time he was 6. The siphon was not cruelty. It was protection. He had kept the excess magic flowing not into waste but into the war effort, into the specific operations that had maintained the resistance, that had protected countless lives, that had kept people alive who would otherwise have died. I did not do this for my own enrichment, he said, and his voice was calm and deep and carried the absolute conviction of a man who believed every word. I did it because no one else was willing to make the hard calculations. No one else was willing to pay the price. The question was never whether Harry Potter would be comfortable, the question was whether Harry Potter would survive to an age where he could fulfill the purpose his existence had generated. I managed the conditions of that survival. I make no apology for it. The chamber was silent. Harry stood up. He did not ask permission. He was the heir claimant and had the procedural right to address the court directly at any point during the respondent's address, and he exercised it with the flat, unhurried certainty of someone who has been waiting for exactly this moment for exactly the right amount of time. You did not know, Harry said, and his voice in the stone chamber had the carrying quality that it had always had, the structural resonance that Griphook had noticed when he was 3 and that had only deepened, that I was going to be found. You did not know that the siphon would be severed. You did not know that I would be raised in an environment where I had access to your records and the time to read them. He paused. You calculated the conditions of my survival, as you said. But you only calculated one version of survival. The version where I was found by you, managed by you, kept small enough to be safe, large enough to be useful, grateful enough not to question. He looked at Dumbledore directly. You did not calculate me. Dumbledore met his eyes. Across the chamber, across 10 years and a treaty and 150 pages of evidence and a morning of testimony and 30 years of accumulated decisions, the two of them looked at each other, and Harry felt nothing that he hadn't felt walking into this chamber. No fear, no anger that wasn't already cold and structural, no grief that wasn't his to carry without it breaking him. He was 11 years old and he was standing in the oldest legal chamber in Britain and he was completely, absolutely himself. You made me a project, Harry said. My parents were characters in your story. Snape was a tool you shaped with guilt. McGonagall was a loyalty you exploited through trust. Every person in your orbit was a resource you managed with the confidence of someone who had decided that their judgment was good enough to override consent. He paused. It wasn't. It never is. That's not a personal failing, it's structural. The moment anyone decides that their vision is worth other people's autonomy, they have already become exactly what they claim to oppose. He sat down. The chamber was very still. Dumbledore stood for another moment. Something moved through his face, not guilt, not yet, maybe not ever in the way that Harry would recognize, but something that was, perhaps, the first genuine encounter with the boundary of his own argument, the place where the explanation ran out and what was underneath it was simply what it was. He sat down. Chief Justice Stonecrown looked at the chamber with the equanimity of a mountain that has been here before, that will be here again, that finds the question of human error neither surprising nor particularly interesting, only necessary to address. She conferred with the 2 associate justices in gobbledygook too rapid and too idiomatic for the translation earpieces to follow. The deliberation took 12 minutes. The ruling came in 4 parts. First, the treaty-protected record was confirmed as valid and irrefutable. The siphon had been placed, had operated, and had been removed. These were facts of record and no subsequent proceeding could reclassify them. Second, the Accord of 1792 wardship of Harry James Potter by Gringotts Institution and specifically by Griphook of Clan Ironmaw was confirmed as legally unimpeachable from the point of initiation. All rights, assets, and inheritance of the House of Potter were confirmed as fully in Harry's possession, unencumbered, retroactive to November 2, 1981. Third, the systematic pattern of magical siphoning documented across 30 years constituted a violation of the International Statute of Magical Rights, Articles 3, 7, and 12, articles that the Ministry of Magic had signed in 1942 and that sat within the High Court's jurisdiction regardless of domestic wizarding law. Albus Dumbledore was formally cited for these violations. The citations would be transmitted to the International Confederation of Wizards and to every signatory nation of the statute within 48 hours. Fourth, the question of additional proceedings, criminal, civil, institutional, was referred to the relevant authorities as specified under the statute, with the High Court's documentation provided as primary evidentiary record. Dumbledore remained still throughout the ruling. His composure had not broken. Harry did not expect it to break here, in this chamber, with these people watching. The composure was, at this point, almost irrelevant. The documentation existed, the record was irrefutable, the citations were international, and the man who had been the most trusted figure in the wizarding world was going to spend the rest of his life in the specific, grinding process of institutions recalibrating their relationship to a story they had trusted completely. That was its own kind of consequence. Griphook collected his documents with the methodical efficiency of someone who has completed a 10-year project and is now doing the administrative closeout. He didn't look particularly satisfied. He looked, to Harry, the way he looked after a complex inheritance assessment that had gone well, professionally complete. Task finished. Next task. Harry stood. He looked at Dumbledore one more time. The old man was still in his chair, looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of someone doing a different kind of arithmetic now, smaller, more personal, the kind that doesn't involve strategies or pieces on a board but only the simple, private ledger of what you have done and what it cost and who paid. Harry didn't say anything. Outside the chamber, in the stone corridor that smelled of deep earth and old mountain, Hermione was waiting. She had been in the public gallery throughout and she had the controlled expression of someone who has been holding their composure through several hours of very dense proceedings and is now in a position to stop. "It's done," she said. "The court part is done," Harry said. "The rest of it," he gestured vaguely in the direction of a world that was currently processing a set of facts that were going to take considerably longer than a single morning to fully absorb. "Years," she said. "It's going to take years." "Yes." He paused. "Are you staying?" She looked at him with the expression she got when a question had an obvious answer and she was deciding whether to say so. "Obviously," she said. "I have 6 months of research to finish and I haven't read everything in the restricted archive yet and Hogwarts has at least 4 texts I haven't been able to locate anywhere else." A pause, and then something softer underneath the efficiency, "and yes. Obviously." Griphook came out of the chamber behind them, documents under his arm, Flintrock beside him. He looked at Harry with the flat dark eyes and Harry looked back and they stood there in the corridor for a moment in the specific kind of silence that didn't require filling. "Well done," Griphook said. 2 words. The maximum. "You built it," Harry said. "I built the platform," Griphook said. "You stood on it." He paused. "There is a difference." McGonagall came out next, then Thornwick, then the witnesses filing out in 1s and 2s. Snape came out last, alone, coat pulled close, the self-contained quality intact but with something different in the texture of it, lighter, somehow, the difference between armor worn for protection and armor worn because it had been put on so long ago you forgot it could come off. He walked past Harry and then stopped and turned, and looked at him for a moment. "Your mother would have conducted that rather differently," he said. "Not critically. Observationally." "How?" Harry asked. "More anger," Snape said. "She had considerably more anger available than you do." A pause. "It was, possibly, more frightening without it." Harry thought about this. "She built the magic that stopped Voldemort," he said. "She had more time to be angry about it. I've had 10 years to do something useful with mine." Snape looked at him for another long moment. She would have liked you, he said. It came out with the quality of something that had been very carefully not said for a long time and was now being said and was, in being said, costing something real. Very much. I know, Harry said. I read her notes. Something in Snape's face, the old sharp thing, the grief, moved, and was contained, and then moved again and wasn't entirely contained, and then Snape nodded once, turned, and walked down the corridor in the direction of the portkey platform with the measured step of someone carrying a weight that is somewhat lighter than it was this morning. Harry watched him go. Pauline Perrot stopped beside him on her way out, the woman from France, the one whose diagnostic had sparked the 6. She had the bearing of someone who had spent 25 years carrying something they couldn't prove and was now in the specific state of someone who has been believed in a room with witnesses. She looked at Harry with eyes that were grateful and fierce and completely dry. There will be others, she said. Who contact Gringotts after today? More than 6. I know, Harry said. What happens to them? Full diagnostic review through the High Court secondary proceedings, Harry said. Documented, recorded, cited. Compensation through the Potter estate for each confirmed case. Gringotts Legal set the mechanism yesterday. He paused. And their names in the record. Officially. Not as footnotes. She looked at him for a moment. Then she held out her hand, not the wizarding way, wrist forward, but flat, palm down, the way his mother had shaken hands in the photographs, the straightforward Muggle way. Harry shook it. Your mother's daughter, she said, which was neither accurate nor inaccurate and was, in any case, the best kind of thing someone could say. She walked away down the corridor. The portkey home was at 4 o'clock. Harry spent the intervening hour in the small antechamber that the High Court maintained for party use between sessions, sitting with his back to the wall and the photograph album on his knees. He opened it to the Summerfield photograph, his parents, his father's arm, his mother midlaugh with those eyes, and looked at it for a while. The thing about growing up with Griphook and Ragnarok and Iron Veil and Thornwick and Coppervein and all the dense, warm, unrelenting life of the Iron Maw clan was that it had given him something that no training or strategy or rune sequence could produce, the absolute certainty that he was not his story. Not the boy who lived, not Dumbledore's managed weapon, not the orphan defined by absence and survival. He was Harry Potter, who had learned gobbledygook before English, who had eaten spiced mushroom broth and taken a wooden puzzle apart with his mind and read his mother's research notes by lamplight in a London office and shaken hands with 6 people whose names were going into the record. His parents looked back at him from the photograph. His father was laughing at something. His mother, for just a moment, seemed to look directly at him, the way photographs that were taken with a lot of magic sometimes did, not responding to a command but responding to something more instinctive. And her expression was not grief and not pride in the performed way and not the sacred object quality that the wizarding world put on her when they described what she'd done. It was just recognition. The straightforward, immediate recognition of something familiar in an unfamiliar face. There you are, her expression said. Harry closed the album. Griphook appeared in the doorway. Portkey in 10 minutes. Ready, Harry said. He stood up. Put the album inside his jacket, against his chest. Picked up his bag. Hogwarts tomorrow? Griphook said. Yes. He paused. Are you staying in London? For now. The secondary proceedings will require my presence. Griphook looked at him with the dark flat eyes. Ragnarok wants a full debrief this evening. How is he? Satisfied, Griphook said. Which from Ragnarok means he is feeling a very large amount and expressing none of it. Familiar, Harry said. A pause. Something crossed Griphook's face that had been crossing it on occasion for about 10 years, the involuntary quality of something amused that had not entirely agreed to be amused. Yes, he said. I suppose it is. They walked together down the stone corridor toward the portkey platform, Harry's boots on the ancient floor and the blue-white light of the mountain stone around them and the documents of a completed case under Griphook's arm. Behind them, in the chamber, the records were being sealed and copied and dispatched to the International Confederation's 43 member nations. In London, the evening edition of The Prophet was being typeset with a headline that would land on 800,000 breakfast tables in the morning. In a cottage in Wiltshire, Albus Dumbledore was sitting by a fire that had probably gone cold, doing the smallest and most private kind of arithmetic. In a Gringotts vault 300 feet below London, a sanguine reveal record dated November 1, 1981 Saturday in its sealed case, the original, the first one, the one that Griphook had performed on a cold street with his grandmother's instruments and a drop of blood from a sleeping infant's heel. It had been sitting there for 10 years and it would continue to sit there, irrefutable and intact, because the truth that the instruments reported didn't age and didn't negotiate and didn't care what anyone found convenient. It was just there. The way truth was. Harry stepped onto the portkey platform beside Griphook, and Hermione was already there with her research notes, and Thornwick was already there with her ledger, and Broadfong was already there at the platform's edge with the flat watchful expression of someone who had been on guard since 1981 and was not, on the basis of today's events, planning to stand down. "Ready?" Griphook said. Harry looked at the platform. At the carved record runes of 150 years of proceedings. At the mountain stone and the ancient light and the world above them that was, this evening, a different shape than it had been this morning. "Yes," he said. Griphook activated the portkey. The mountain folded away and London unfolded around them, amber and coal smoke and the smell of used magic and the dense, living noise of a city that did not stop, and Harry Potter stood in it with his mother's eyes and his father's hair and a goblin blade at his hip and nothing, not one single thing, to hide. Above him, London went on. And below him, in the gold-lit warmth of the deep vaults, the record sat. Complete.